Yeah, I routed it to a few last week.
Adios. That's what I would say.
Good, I'm routing a card for Councilmember Moss. And then we're doing the push to the top. Wonderful.
How are you? Councilmember Whalen, how are you? Yeah, that is cool.
She's the one that comes. Yes.
So when we studied it, it wasn't financial.
They're sending us on.
Spend the whole day.
No, I have one. Yeah, I have
It's good to see you.
What do we got going on here for you tonight?
I came to listen in on the pavement.
Oh, the pavement cut thing? Yeah, there's an addendum. Did you get the addendum that came out? It's the PSC addendum. It's jacks it up 50%. Yeah. So, yeah, exactly.
Is that my signature at the bottom?
Yeah.
Call this Lakewood City Council for Monday, July 23rd to order. The first item for discussion is the microphone system, which has reverted to one where if you want to talk, you push the button down and hold it. The second item is the second quarter 2018 police report. Chief Zarro.
Thank you, Mayor Anderson, council members. Similar to the first quarter, what I will probably not go into as much discussion just about the stats. If you have questions, I'd be happy to answer them, but there's some other highlights that I'll talk about at the end. But of note, a couple things of note. One, there has been a reduction, which is always nice to highlight in both person crimes and property crimes as you compare it from second quarter this year to second quarter of last year, which equates to an overall reduction in crime. I want to get to, as you've seen before, we look at motels and mobile homes and apartments by size. So we have a better understanding of or we look at them as a ratio of calls for service per units. just because we think that's more fair. And we see our calls for service are still driven more by some of the smaller apartments and the motels, the smaller motels and mobile home parks. And we do still see some of the same names. We are working on them. The Carwan Village has been on the top of our list for a while. We are working on them.
Thank you very much, Mr. Mayor. And the chief doesn't need to be here when but I do want to sometime, either after this presentation or later tonight, have a discussion specifically about the Carwan Village and the number of calls for service they have, which is essentially now over 1 a day, which means, in my mind, puts them in the nuisance category. And either we can have the discussion now or immediately after this as to what steps we should be asking city staff to take going forward to get this, do something either about their business license or just get them shut down if they can't improve their situation. Because and I know closing mobile home parks is a big deal, but really in this case, the residents are deciding that this is a public nuisance, and that if something doesn't happen, I mean, this is ridiculous. I mean, this is a very good example of when the criminal justice system can't do what is really the problem here, which is we're just showing up every day. Might as well just assign an officer to them. So I'd like to have a discussion somewhere along the way about what we're going to do.
Perhaps Chief, we could divert here. The city manager, I don't see anyone from planning, building department here, but I know that there was this concern in the past, and it seemed to be on, if I'm recalling correctly, on a better track with a new owner, but it seems to be the worst it's been.
It did, excuse me, they had a new owner or a new manager come in and started to clean things up, but then that was very short term, and it backslid to being what you see here and what Mr. Boki's been referencing. So that's not uncommon to see in different mobile home parks, is a new manager or somebody will step in and start making the changes that we say need to be made. So we, see a brief reduction in calls, and then, for one reason or another, it's not a permanent fix, and we end up going back.
Is there any current enforcement action going on? I see Mr. Buer entered the room.
Carwan Village.
Carwan Village.
Potential business revocation of their current license. That's under review. A draft document is to be submitted sometime this late week for further consideration by staff and by the legal department. There are pros and cons to this approach, but we do have a problem with the current ownership of not paying attention to the units in the front of Carwan Village.
So was there a prior enforcement action started under earlier ownership?
Yes, there was a significant amount of enforcement action taken, numerous civil infractions issued against the previous owner. The owner paid those fines and then thereafter decided to go ahead and sell the park. So we have a new owner. He's purchased 2 parks in Lakewood, one park off of 96, which he's managing fairly well. And this park, he seems to be over his head. He has attempted to bring in private security. That has not worked. The previous owner was required to install some additional water and or sewer lines into the site. She did do that. So there's been some upgrade to the property, but we're just not getting the current owner's attention. So the idea would be to come forward with the business license revocation and then meet with him and say, can we fix this? Because this is the next stage in the process.
So is this similar to the procedure that was undertaken with the Golden Lion?
Yes. But there were some mistakes made in the Golden Lion that we just do not wish to make again.
Thank you. Any other questions for Mr. Buer?
Yeah, I guess for the chief and Mr. Buer, this slide represents a call for service by the police department. And the actions that we're contemplating looking into taking have to do with code violations. I mean, is there a real link between this slide and the conditions in the park that are part of the actions that that are code enforcement?
In the past, when we've used the business license revocation process, it's a combination of serious calls for service, and it can also be a combination of property maintenance violations as well.
And so in this particular case, is this the more serious, or is the property piece?
Based upon the information that's been presented to me by the police department, is the ongoing serious calls for service that have occurred on the site that have not been rectified by the current ownership.
And Mr. Branstetter, if I understand what you're getting at a little bit is is there a nexus between some of the code issues and the calls for service and the reasons we're going out there? And there absolutely is, and a lot of it has to do with the people managing the park willing to be responsible for the park and what goes on there, whether it's code or the criminals that are allowed to stay there, which is a lot of what we go there for. And that is the nexus, is the management there and how much responsibility they want to take for actually running a mobile home park.
So in terms of the calls for service, what's the most common nature of them?
From what I hear on the radio, a lot of it is, there's domestics, and then there's people with warrants that somebody calls and says, hey, so-and-so is here with a warrant, or some of it is officers going there to look for somebody that they know has a warrant, and that's where they hang out. It's just sort of this place where people who are wanted go to hide out.
Okay, so people with warrants, and it's, as you say, it's a place where they go to do that. But generally, the warrants aren't for activities that took place at the park.
Sometimes it is, but a lot of times it is warrants for other, for wherever they committed their crime. Might have been somewhere else, and that's where the warrant's from.
Mr. Branstetter, we've also had issues with stolen vehicles on site. On the health and safety side of things, we've had people living in carports, people defecating on the site and having those materials end up in the stormwater basin that belongs to the city of Tacoma. So it's just a whole variety of things.
I mean, is this a situation where they advertise for tenants at the Department of Corrections and somewhere? I mean, and how does that become a gathering place for felons, of where they feel it's a place to gather?
From my perspective, the manager's not maintaining or paying attention to who he's leasing to. That's problem number one. And the other problem, the lessee or the tenants are allowing their buddies and friends to show up, which is not, and then live there on a permanent basis. And the ownership, the management's not doing anything about it. And that's what seems to be creating most of the problems, is the way in which people are residing in the mobile home park. I don't know if the chief wants to add to that.
No, that's accurate.
Do we know the ratio between tenant-owned and park-owned homes?
I believe we do, but I do not have that information this evening.
That might be an interesting fact as we consider whether we extend rental housing safety measures to mobile home parks where there are rental units included.
Well, that is a future question for the council. Right now, we're just trying to get the program up and operating. But, you know, these kinds of issues keep coming forward on rental housing issues in mobile home parks.
No homework tonight. Sorry for the diversion, Chief.
No problem.
Please carry on.
No problem. And again, it's just some graphs demonstrating the person crimes by quarter. We see, you know, somewhat of a seasonal spike, and this second quarter is significantly lower than last second quarter, which, you know, we always like to see. Western State Hospital, for as much heat as they've been taking and as much trouble as they're having with their accreditation and the treatment side of the house, as far as their impact on us and the crimes going on there, they're making progress. These were you know, you can see it's been on a significant downward trend, minus that spike in the second quarter last year for some time. Walmart, I like this slide, but it is deceiving. I looked into why it's fallen off the table, and apparently they're in the process of upgrading their camera system. So they're not actually seeing the thefts take place. So we'll see what happens once they get their new camera system in. And again, you know, I'm sure Walmart is a contributing factor to it, but property crimes reduced from second quarter last year. And crimes against society, again, you know, I've talked before about those being sort of what those are, and some of them being self-generated, but they are a lot of times can be like you'll have a domestic where someone's arrested and there's some, you know, a meth or something in their pocket, and that is a contributing factor and also counts as a crime against society. And then total crime, fairly flat from the first quarter, but you know, as you look compared to second quarter last year, a reduction. And also in the report, as you'll see, there's, you know, the districts at a glance that we started putting in there a few quarters ago, so you get an idea of what calls are being generated in each district. And then accidents, you know, these are something we're really starting to pay close attention to. This isn't, you know, in general, we've, you know, seen an increase over, you know, if we look over multiple years, like 10 years, but that's nationwide. I am happy to see a significant decrease from first quarter to second quarter, but still there's just a lot of collisions that keep our officers busy.
We have information in the latest Public Works on intersections that are problematic or construction times of the year that are challenging.
We do, and I've produced heat maps in the past and talked to Public Works about that, and really it's a little deceiving because you can have an intersection like 108th and Bridgeport or 112th and Bridgeport that has a significant number of collisions, but there's also a lot of vehicle traffic that goes through those intersections. Some of the criminal incidents that we've, you know, started tracking, you know, we had in the second quarter a series of shootings where nobody was hit. I think there was 4 of them in the matter of a few weeks. And really troubling, and just very lucky that nobody was hit because they were in broad daylight with a lot of people around. In 3 of the 4, we've made arrests and identified suspects. In the one where we haven't, we essentially know who was involved, but nobody wants to be a victim and say, here's what happens, yeah, they were shooting at us. So it's hard for us to make an arrest on that. However, we do know what apartments they were associated with or where they were living, and the apartment managers evicted them. So we at least got them moved out of the neighborhood they were in. We had the unfortunate incident with the Yambo family. It was the murder-suicide, which, just tragic. It's hard on our officers, just hard to imagine. That will be reflected as 3 homicides, although it was just one incident. But we reviewed that too. I wanted to see if there was a time when, Lakewood, where we might have been able to intervene. There were actually recent transplants, or fairly recent transplants to Lakewood, from Texas up to, I think, Spanaway, and then over to Lakewood, moving to be near family, I guess. But there was no time where I saw that we could have intervened, or we had the opportunity to intervene. The second quarter, we also had the sad suicide of the 14-year-old girl that I think many of you know about. There led to some media attention and some protests at the junior high school. Ultimately, we did investigate that. I know there were allegations of bullying, but ultimately nothing that would be prosecutable. The reduction in property crimes, we are seeing a small increase in vehicle thefts, however, somewhat stable. So some of the other highlights in the second quarter, a little bit more on the positive side. We did go through our reaccreditation, our on-site visit from WASPIC, which anybody that's been through an accreditation process knows that's very time-consuming, getting all the policies in place that you need and just getting all the help that you need and focusing on that. That occurred on June 13th. We had a successful visit, and we have been reaccredited for the next 4 years, and I'll receive the certificate for that at the WASPIC conference in November. Our 1920 budget process is underway. That's something we've been focusing on as well. We had a small and attractive assets audit that we were working through. What I learned is that my idea of an attractive asset is different than others. We still had to track it down though. We received the AWC Award for Municipal Excellence. Thank you to Mr. Brandstetter for representing the city there and accepting the award. That was for our phlebotomy program. Very nice recognition for the program, and as I said, I think at the last quarterly presentation, I'm not ashamed to squeeze that for as much positive recognition as we can get. So if there's other awards out there for it, I'll line up to take them. We did have the Pierce County Law Enforcement Memorial Ceremony, which is always, it's sad to recall all the officers lost in the line of duty, but it's a nice event in that we're able to recognize and acknowledge them. Also, we're able to get some hiring done. Hired 2 lateral officers, Jamin Dobson, who you saw sworn in last Monday night. Hired him from Port of Seattle, but he was actually with the city of Seattle before that for many years. And then Matt Lightgib was a lateral from Mason County, but he'd spent a lot of years with Federal Way before that. And he was not sworn in last week because he actually was injured. He is still on training. He and his training officer were trying to get a person suffering mental illness from running around the freeway on I-5. Well, this person turned around and cracked Matt in the mouth with his cell phone and knocked out several of his teeth. So, exactly. So he's home recouping, and once he's better, we're going to get him in front of the council again to be sworn in, just because I think that it's nice to do. Nice for you to see them and for them to see you. And then also the promotion of Detective Sean Conlon. So he's been an outstanding investigator, and I'm sure will be a valued asset as a detective. One of the other things that we participated in, and this was sort of ongoing before the second quarter, however, we got the final results here in the second quarter, and it was a research program through the Police Foundation. And they're a nonprofit that was established in 1970, and they connected with Assistant Chief Unfrid, who facilitated some of this, and they did surveys of both internal surveys and a community survey. The internal survey focused on officer safety and wellness and technology, and the external survey was a community satisfaction survey with the police department. I was actually very pleased with the results. We did have a lot of participation from the department. I think between 60 and 70 people participated in the survey. Some of it was about the as you can see, the media and public protests and what's that done to their sentiment as you know, about their own safety. And most of them said that they're more concerned about their own safety because of some of the increased scrutiny and the negative media attention. And it's resulted in the public treating them with less respect, just to some degree, not to a great degree, but just to some, which is one of the reasons why you've seen the accolades that I push out to the entire department when they come in from community members, because I want them to see that there is a genuine appreciation for what they do from the community. All that being said, they still are interested in going out and doing their job. It has not dissuaded them from going out and making contacts with people. They have, we had positive responses on the equipment that we provide, making them feel safer, the training being sufficient. This is one thing that bothered me a little bit. The ballistic vests, only 92% say they always wear their vest, but that's, there were some detectives that took this as well. And if you're in a plainclothes assignment, you don't always wear your vest. The seatbelt one bothers me. That should be 100%. But I don't know how much they read the word always to mean literally always, and not, you know, you do take it off as you're approaching a call or maybe a block away. And then mixed results for the vests, the reflective vests. Generally engaging in healthy habits, which I like to see, and 73% said that tobacco consumption was not applicable. I would love to see results of a survey like this from like 20, 25 years ago. It'd be drastically different in pretty much all aspects. And then some of the things that I kind of knew or have experienced myself showed up in the survey as well. And one of the things that affects us the most are sleeping issues, especially if you spend enough time on graveyard. And then we had our retirement survey as a part of it, which is telling. You can see when some of the blocks we can expect to see some blocks of people retire. And just through this survey, 13 people said they were going to retire in less than 5 years. So that's a pretty significant turnover for a department our size. Technologies are generally viewed positively and as helpful to the officers. Basically pretty much across the board. Now the community survey results were also generally positive. We didn't have thousands of people take the survey, but enough that when we compare it to the community satisfaction survey that the city did recently, it sort of matches up in the general sentiment towards police. One of the biggest ones are on that mean the most to me are on the professionalism that they feel the police department has, and that they are they strongly agree that they would feel comfortable calling the police department if they needed help. And then, so that's the end of the survey portion, and I'd be happy to answer any questions there are on that. But I also threw in a little bit of statistical analysis of the 4th of July from this year, knowing that it's a current topic of discussion, even though it's technically the 3rd quarter. But as you can see, the calls for service really haven't changed that much on the 3rd, 4th, or 5th. Last year there was a dip on the 4th, but it got back to a fairly, consistent number, or a number that's consistent with years past. And I throw this out, I know that there's going to be more discussion had on the topic, and I'm actually, I put out a question to WASPIC members on a board, that online board, asking if there's been anybody that's had effective legislative policies on fireworks. And that's, you know, when the time comes, that'll be part of the presentation is my feedback on that. So, but I did want to present this to you tonight just because it is current. So, with that, I'll be happy to entertain any questions anybody has on any portion of the presentation or anything going on with the police department.
Questions from Chief Zarro?
Observation.
Mr. Simpson?
Thank you very much for the presentation. I just caught the word caffeine on one of the slides, and it reminded me of something I read in the Wall Street Journal about an algorithm that the Army is developing where caffeine is used in a very judicious manner to keep people sharp. So when I saw that reducing caffeine intake, you and I will have that discussion, I assure you, at some later date.
Okay, well, it's the military's intent on you know, their program that creates caffeine addicts may or may not translate well into police work.
Actually, the study is planned to be extended to police officers, Chief.
Okay. Yeah, that's true.
But
That's
no,
true.
I just saw that, and I just.
They're high
wanted to-
functioning.
Yeah, I just wanted to point that out, that there may be, not that I'm arguing one way or the other, but there may be there's a little more out there than meets the eye about caffeine intake. I mean, the Army is very serious about it.
Well, and this is a self-assessment by the officers.
Exactly.
What they
So
want
what
to do
they
is
think.
reduce, yeah, so, we'll
I'll be
see.
around to needle you.
All right.
Thanks, Chief.
Mr. Whalen?
So one thing that may be reflected there, but in a different manner, is how many calls or responses to service warrants did we have for the SWAT team in the second quarter?
Oh, that's an excellent question. That's one that given the projects that we're working on, I should have brought that forward. There was in the second quarter, a few warrants, no active incidents, but a few warrants. I'll get those numbers and get them back to you.
The last couple of quarters anyway. I don't think it's been a lot. I think we had one accolade for a recent warrant delivery this last week. but
Yeah, that
that's
was
been,
special ops, our special ops that they served the warrant for.
Right, okay.
So Chief, when you come back with fireworks info, could you, for simplicity's sake, put that together with aid and fire calls?
Yes.
So we can see it all and, you know, by year. I know sometimes they overlap, but it would, I think, give us a better picture if we saw how much, truth versus anecdote, how many fires there actually were or were not, and
Yeah, absolutely.
and ANCAR of how many people
Blew their hands off.
Blew their hand off, whether or not they did. Yeah.
Yes, absolutely.
Thanks. Any other questions? Thank you very much.
Thank you all.
We move to rental housing safety program update with Mr. Gum and Mr. Buer.
Okay. Good evening, Mr. Mayor, Deputy Mayor, Council. Happy to be here to provide you with a new update, and since we've been doing this a little bit longer, we have a little bit more information to actually get to you. It's kind of nice to have some inspections under our belt and kind of show you what we've been doing. So with that, kind of show you what we're going to do. We'll go through some of the same stuff that we've done in the last slide, show you some of the program registrations, trends, property types, kind of where we're going, what inspections have found, some of the common things, and near the end, kind of show you some of the good things that we found as well. So it's not only a program that's revealing issues with properties that are in a negative manner, but ones that are kind of nice to see, and owners that are actually doing a really good job out there. So registration, this kind of shows you the upward trend. We've kind of gotten to a point where realistically, a lot of the properties have registered, especially the units. What we're seeing is total rental properties have kind of plateaued at about 2,000 registered, 2,100, and about 10,300 of those being rental units that are registered. Honestly believe that a lot of these properties that haven't registered, the thing is they're single families. These numbers are kind of being weighted down by single families that tend to flip and turn fairly quickly. They're not very easy for us to kind of put our finger on and figure out which ones they are. And when we do, it seems like they're turning quicker than we can keep up with. So a lot of these numbers are weighted down by that. Most of the multifamilies have complied. There's still a few out there that haven't. They aren't any of the really big complexes, so it's kind of just some of the outliers and some of the smaller ones. And we're working to get those ones into compliance, kind of following through with writing letters and calling and contacting and code enforcement, all kinds of fun things. As you can see, the registered percentage of total, the rental units, you're looking at getting close to 80% of the actual rental units, at least known rental units registered, and getting close to 60% of the rental properties. And again, single family, I think, is weighting this down a little bit. And we've got about 2,000 properties that we originally thought were rental properties that have been exempted based on they're either owner occupied or their family lives there, or they're sold and they're no longer rental properties. So we've had some exempted from this as well. Here's where it's a little bit different than last time. We've started conducting inspections in April. As of last week, we completed 74 inspections. Starting to do a lot more multifamily properties. When I first showed you this slide, it was primarily single families that we'd inspected, or at least I think it was 52% at that point in time. So we're starting to get into more multifamily properties and inspecting some of the bigger complexes. The next slide will kind of break those numbers down for you. And these numbers have changed a little bit, I can tell you. Up to last week, when you go to the two green columns, total units inspected and total units. Last week, the city, we've added 61 units that were inspected, so now we're looking at 340 units roughly that we've inspected, and another 215 total units that represents. So we're looking at a fairly significant number of units that we've started inspecting since April.
So that represents how many city inspectors doing the work?
Two. There's 3 inspectors. Typically, right now, we're going out with 2 of us, either myself and Heather Hulverstad or myself and Martha Larkin, so I can bring them up to speed and do the inspections. But when you go out to some of the big complexes, which we've started doing kind of regularly, we're looking at 50 units, and 2 of us in a day, we're going through those pretty quickly. So it does take 2 to go out and do those big complexes.
Both Martha and Heather have had previous experience with doing inspections, either through the HUD program or Heather Holberstadt used to work as a property manager.
Okay.
Yeah, so.
Mr. Branstetter.
How many inspection properties have chosen to have a non-city inspector do the inspection?
5, I believe. We've only had one of them that's completed the inspection. The inspector that is doing the other 4 has told us he's done them, but he hasn't entered anything to the computer system, so only one has, and that one passed.
And do you have any idea what the non-city inspectors are charging property owners to do this?
The ones that I've talked to are 100 to 150 a unit, and it goes down from there if they're doing multiple units, obviously. But for a single family, that's what they were charging.
Okay, thank you.
So properties inspected, you can see at this point in time, we've done 74, representing about 1,000 rental units. What we're seeing is a lot of initial property inspections failing. So a lot of those inspections are failing for some of the same things that I mentioned in the last thing. You've still got issues with GFI, GFCI protections. Water heater straps is a fairly common thing. Smoke detectors, amazingly enough, is still a fairly common thing that we're seeing failures of, which is kind of interesting because the fire department has been doing those for free for a number of months. So we've been passing that information along as these units fail, so they can get those done. And we're starting to get some that are passing, especially along the re-inspections. So we're starting to get, once we go out and do the inspections, we'd send them a notification of what failed and how they need to correct that. And we're starting to see, especially in the single family, a lot of those are starting to pass. Multifamilies, we haven't actually done a lot of re-inspections of those properties yet. They're still making those corrections. And a lot of them are fairly sizable complexes. So when you go out and inspect a unit, say like Morning Tree that has, I forget, 200 to 300 units. I mean, once they have to make all of the water heater straps and the GFI corrections, it's a 2.5, 3 month process for them. So we're gonna start seeing a lot of the multifamilies start coming into compliance and passing inspections probably within the next month, month and a half. And as I was mentioning, a lot of the common items that are failing, you can see is smoke detectors, water heaters, and GFCI receptors are what we've kind of dominated. What we're starting to see now is you're starting to get some structural components and plumbing and electrical issues as well. So when we're going out, a lot of the multifamily complexes have had a lot of electrical issues. Quite a few of them have had some plumbing issues, whether it be leaking water or things just don't function properly. And then structural components would be things like stairwells we've seen in some multifamily buildings that are starting to get bad and fail, decks, all kinds of structural components inside from just poor maintenance and delayed maintenance. And on the right, you can kind of see some of the things that we've seen. The top right photo is something you'll see a little bit later in the slideshow. It was a multifamily complex, which I believe is Morning Tree. All of their units, amazingly enough, are very nice, very well maintained. The problem was every single unit that we inspected in that complex, all of the buildings, their power rooms had horrible failures for electrical systems. So the units are fine. It's just the common areas that were not very safe, which unfortunately is the part that's gonna burn the buildings down. The middle one was a shower that we looked at in a single family, and the bottom one is a photo of a garbage disposer in a single family unit that, I don't know if you can tell or not, but there's a yellow wire kind of that comes out of an electrical panel in the back. That's an extension cord. Somebody decided to wire an outlet with an extension cord, which isn't an acceptable thing to do. And this is the one I was mentioning, the Morning Tree Apartments. We went out and inspected this about a month, probably a month and a half ago. And it's, like I said, it's a fairly decent complex. The issues that they had were with common spaces. None of the units themselves had any issues of significance. What we found was electrical panels, like I mentioned, in all of the buildings. None of them had service panel covers on them. They literally had wires sticking out of the service panels all over the place, all kinds of junctions and connections, and yeah, it wasn't so good. And the first picture you can see on the left, that is it used to be an apartment that they converted into a storage room. So multiple tenants have storage in those units. What is lacking, clearly you can see there's no sheetrock that separates it. There's an apartment above that and apartments on the left side of that in the picture. So there's no fire separation at all. When you're storing things in there, it's a huge fire hazard.
Mr. Mayor? So the electrical thing is interesting to me, that every box and every common area wide open. So clearly somebody who came in and worked on it. So is it just a matter of they just need to put a cover on it, or is there real wiring issues?
There's a lot of wiring issues. And in the picture that you can see that I put up there for you, there's somebody ran a wire. What happens is the wires come out, they go into this lovely electrical tape section, and then it runs with a bare exposed wire that goes out. A lot of the boxes had all kinds of modifications of wiring, and I did not see any permits that were signed off for any of the modifications.
So in that case, clearly it's a danger.
Yes.
How much time do you give them?
This apartment complex, I think, asked for 3 months to get everything completed, and they had a number of units that had to get, believe they had water heater straps and some other issues that they had to do as well in all of their units and all of the service panels. And right now, trying to get an electrician out to do anything is next to impossible. So it's something that we gave them an extension. We're going to monitor them. We typically follow up in a month and kind of see where they are. see what they've done and see if they're on schedule.
Now, this is just off 87th or whatever. It's a different address, but it's over near Oak. They had
It
a
is.
fire there a few years ago. It wasn't caused by this, though, was it?
I don't know if it was caused by this. They had a number of repairs that they did. I think they did some roof repairs, some decks. They had a fire. It was, I don't remember if it was into one of the units or one of the buildings. But yeah, they've had some issues over the years. And by and large, I mean, it's a reasonably well-maintained complex. There's just huge electrical issues that remain right now. And the other thing that you can see, it's kind of doesn't show very well in the picture, but they've got a stair handrail that runs up and it kind of stops 2/3 away up the deck, and then they tied another handrail at the top of it. It's not a continuous handrail, so someone walking up there needs to have a hand hold all the way up rather than something they can catch themselves on and fall down. The next complex that we looked at, this was what we're starting to see is building enforcement is going out and looking, or at least they're getting calls, and they're looking at properties that have stairway failures or deck failures or water intrusion. The building department goes out and looks at these units, and then they send the information on to us. We then follow up with the owners and send them a letter of required inspection, so that once they have code deficiencies that are identified, the rental housing inspection program can have those units inspected. In this case, there was 32 units. All of those units had significant structural issues. There was the typical flat roof, 1960s era construction, and for the most part, there had been no maintenance on this building for years. So the ceilings have been leaking, from the looks of it, 10, 15 years, possibly even longer. So almost all of the bathroom ceilings had sections that had fallen out. In this case, you can see this was a second floor apartment and it was vacant, luckily, when we showed up. But all of the ceiling rafters you can see all kinds of extensive dry rot and damage. The water, what's happens when it puddles up on the roof, it's a flat roof and it has curbs around it. So you end up with drain pipes that run up to the top. And when they go through the roof penetration, that in essence creates a nice place for when the water gets up to a certain level over the actual roof where its membrane is connected to it. It literally runs down those pipes, or it runs around those things, which is what it's done, is it's kind of started to fail all the bathroom ceilings. The problem, when it does, you've pretty much voided all of the fire barriers from one unit to the next, from tops to bottoms, sideways. So these units that started failing, when they have sheetrock failures, you end up with fire separation that's compromised. I didn't put it in, I did put it in here. The picture, and more pictures, the one on the far left, I was standing in the bathtub. This is when we inspected it. And you can see there's some black plastic in there. I'm standing in a bathtub and I'm looking through the wall at the plumbing into the other bathroom on the other side. So what you see is the shower on the other side. If someone's standing in there, if they were in there taking a shower, they would have been looking back at me. So from one unit to the next, huge fire issues for fire separation. The picture next to it is what they did to fix it. Unfortunately, they didn't get any permits. And when we showed up, they had literally just finished it in the morning before we got there. So they're gonna have to pull some of that stuff off. The picture on the right, you can see, is kind of typical to what's happening in the ceilings. The plumbing starts leaking and then you end up with a huge hole that kind of starts to fail and the ceilings are pulling away. So with that unit, or with that complex, we inspected all 32 units. 30 of them failed. Amazingly enough, 2 passed, and they have significant repairs structurally, as well as through the rental housing safety program. A single family that we looked at.
If I can add a little bit
Go
to
ahead.
that one on Boston. The owner is a new owner who recently purchased that particular piece of property. He is working with the building division. We have not had to relocate anybody. That was one of our earlier concerns with this project. So that's something we monitored very closely because of its budget impacts upon the environment.
Yeah, and something we are seeing kind of on a related note, there are a number of units that we're inspecting. Unfortunately, there haven't been the very good ones right now, but they've had new ownership within the past year and a half. So owners were probably anticipating that they would have to meet these requirements and sold those units. The Lakewood Estates was recently purchased, I think, a year, somewhere in that ballpark ago. So it's a new owner, and he seems to be pretty dedicated to fixing that unit. He's actually looking to buy other units as well. and fix those up. So hopefully he will comply with the program. He's been complying with all of our requests thus far, so. Another one that we looked at, a single family on Bridgeport Way, 9639, actually not more than probably 3 blocks from here. And this is kind of a typical house. We've inspected 3 of them on Bridgeport Way. And they've all kind of had the same results. They for some reason have awnings. You can see on the left picture, they have awnings that pretty much are all failing. This one has a structure that you can see. It's actually supported by a 2x6. There's another 2x6 over here. It runs over and it's kind of partially collapsing in the middle. Some of them have awnings on the front, some of them have awnings on the back on Bridgeport, but all of them, for at least that we've inspected, the 3, they've all have huge structural issues. Improper supporting, they're collapsing. What we tend to run into are you've seen them, the corrugated plastic awnings with 2x4 construction. The problem with those and the problem with this is once it's failed to this extent, it snows a little bit, freezes and thaws, and that thing's gonna come down on somebody's head and do some significant damage at some point in time. The next one in the middle was a sink at that residence, and some of the electrical issues that we see, it's kind of hard to see, but there used to be a garbage disposal, so the wire kind of comes down and terminates right about here. And this was a slide-out drawer. The sink is actually leaking. The water runs down the sink, runs down this little electrical connection, which is an armor cabling, and it drips into a puddle right on top of this thing. And the exposed wires were, I don't know, 1/4 of an inch, 1/2 of an inch away from that. And the owner apparently, I don't know if she was aware of it or not, but she didn't seem too interested and too concerned when I pointed it out to her, but she said she would get it fixed. So I thought it was a significant issue with somebody having wires and a giant puddle of water actively leaking under the sink. The other issue was the bathroom. I didn't take a lot of pictures of this house. It's one of the things, I mean, I don't know, when you go into houses at some point in time and you see there's a lot of issues, I try not to point things out to people, and there's living conditions that somebody, I mean, you can live how you choose to live. If it's a building issue, I have a problem with it. If it's living conditions, this individual, the entire house was pretty much unhealthy. We did point out to the landlord that, hey, you know, there's some unhealthy conditions here. You probably need to address some issues with your tenant and see if you can get him some help. The bathroom, you can see, it probably hadn't been cleaned in, I don't know, a year or 2. It's got a significant crack in the base of the shower. And the walls, you can kind of see they're yellow. As you go up the walls, they were even more yellow. The bathroom was horrible. It had all kinds of electrical problems in this house. Most of the heaters didn't work. The renter, for some reason, was doing his own electrical work. The owner seemed okay with that. So there was a lot of issues with this house. And this is another one that the owner is working to comply. They're going to tear the awnings off the back of the house and hopefully get everything fixed. So we haven't heard for a re-inspection yet, but that one's probably another 2 or 3 weeks away. And then kind of on a positive note, some of the units that we've looked at that were well maintained and well managed. When we went out to the Jet Apartments, we did an inspection. There's 16 units. The managers of this complex, they live in this complex. I think about 3 of their family members live in this complex. They have been there for a number of years. The issues that we had with this complex, there was some water heaters and GFIs, just some typical stuff. But the managers, when we gave them the list, they said, oh, we'll have that done by this next weekend, which I think we inspected it on like a Wednesday. So they were gonna get all this done in 3 days. And I said, well, tell you what, if you get it done by the weekend, give me a call on Monday and I'll buy you lunch. So they called us up on Monday and said, hey, we've got the thing done, come out and re-inspect this. So when we went out and looked at it, they passed with flying colors. They were ecstatic. All of their tenants have been there for a number of years. They're well maintained, well managed. It was a great complex, so I took them lunch and they were happy. One of the kind of gems, this is down in the kind of Don Bridgeport. If you go down near the end of the base, it's a very, very nice, very well-maintained complex. Another one that we went and looked at was Hunter's Glen Apartments. This is a 135-unit complex. Again, this is one that when we went out and inspected it, it had some small issues, some electrical issues, some sinks and stuff were backed up. It wasn't anything that was of significance. The reason being that the maintenance individual that we went around with said he has lived there and he's been the maintenance guy for 14 years. The apartment manager has been there for 13 years. Probably the nicest landscaped apartment complex I've ever seen in my entire life. I mean, it's absolutely impeccably maintained. All of the tenants, the maintenance guy knew every single person in the complex. I mean, it was by name, talked to them, pet their dogs. I mean, he knew everything. It was kind of neat when you go out and you see these complexes where people take great pride in their buildings. Obviously, the owners with this complex, as well as the Jet Apartments, have done a lot to maintain it. They've re-roofed them. They've painted them. They've pretty much done whatever is required to keep these up. One of the other ones that I just wanted to include, we looked at, I think last Wednesday or Thursday, was Brighton Place, which is on 83rd. Another apartment complex with management that's been there a long time, maintenance has been there a long time, and they were beautifully maintained. They passed at their initial inspection as well, so they were a great complex, great management, great owners. And then kind of where we are moving forward, we've got, again, there's actually more inspections. When I put this together, there was 50 properties that we have set to inspect. 262 units will be inspected at those 50 properties. I think we've scheduled probably 10 or 15 more inspections since then. What we're looking to do kind of moving forward on August 1st is to mail out a reminder letter for the lottery owners that they need to get their properties inspected. One of the things that we included in the memo was on October 31st. Basically the notification is going to say that you have to get your properties scheduled to inspected prior to that point in time. Otherwise, city staff isn't going to have time to do a free inspection for you. The reason being that November 1st, we start the lottery process for the next year. There's going to be 2,500 notifications for the next individuals that get the lotteries inspections. There's going to be some compliance follow-up with the code enforcement and city staff and rental housing safety staff to kind of follow up on the individuals and the apartment owners that haven't registered. So there's going to be a significant amount of work at year end to kind of try and get everybody into compliance, do enforcement of those that have not, and then get the next year started. So we're still going to do inspections for individuals after October 31st. We have a number of them that are already scheduled for November and December. The problem is if everybody waits until the end of October and schedules inspections in November and December, there's no way that we can possibly follow up with enforcement and get the next year's program going. So we're encouraging them to get going. And at that point in time, they can use private inspectors if they need to finish their inspections. And then we'll continue to monitor inspection trends, work on enforcement of unregistered properties. And in the memo, there was 3 options that we've included, kind of how we're going to look at enforcing unregistered properties. The thought being a 3-phase. So in phase 1, we would basically notify the owners of the complexes clearly that they're not in compliance, and see if there's a way that we can notify, say, their banks and their insurance companies that, hey, you know, you've got a property who's not followed the rental housing inspection program. There's potentially some issues if they're not doing that from a legal standpoint, as well as a public safety standpoint. So hopefully we'll be able to get some compliance that way. The second one would be you're going to have to do some form of code enforcement activity, and code enforcement activity would be under 5A, I believe it is, where we would do ticketing of the property complexes. So there's a fee, or there's an assessment basically for not complying, and those kind of ratchet up fairly quickly, and it's a per day, per occurrence sort of a fee. And then ultimately, if somebody chooses not to comply, and we've done what we can to kind of cajole them into the process, then ultimately it could lead to a closure of their rental complex or rental unit. So hopefully we don't get there, but that's kind of the 3-phase approach that we're looking at.
If I can, we can just talk very briefly on apartment closures, because it was a part of the report. It appears at this stage that Lakewood Estates is not going to be subject to a closure. They are cooperating with the department, and those that have been shut down, they've been able to move tenants or just not open them up for use. Canterbrook Apartments is something that the department and the fire district have been very concerned about. As of this morning, I received word from the building official that they are cooperating with the fire district, and they are submitting a plan to fix their fire flow problem on the site. We did give you an idea of what it would cost if we had to get to relocation. That's a substantial amount of money, and we're hoping if we can to avoid it by getting the property owner into compliance and correcting the deficiencies in fire flow. There's three or four other properties we're monitoring right now to see if we may have to relocate. At this point, we're not there yet, and something that we watch very carefully. I just wanted to point that out to the council.
Questions for Mr. Bureau or Mr. Gum? Ms. Barth?
How has the rental program been received by the owners out there? Are we getting good reviews, or are we getting nasty feedback, or mixture?
Kind of a mixture of both. I can say one thing, and it's regarding Heather Holverstad, our admin assistant. She has the patience of Job. You go by her cubicle on any given day, and she's typically fielding calls from individuals who aren't very happy with having to have the inspection. She does a fantastic job of listening to their complaints, kind of trying to bring them back in and deal with them. So we do get a number of issues of people who don't agree with the program. I'd say that number has decreased. There are a number of properties that we've gone out to, and people have said, hey, it's about time this thing happened, and clearly we're doing our job to maintain these units. Tenants have been fairly positive. I don't track those numbers. I mean, from what I've seen, it's becoming more positive than it was originally. There's still some of those outliers, and unfortunately, Heather gets to deal with those kind of on a daily basis.
I would say that because of Heather's client service skills, it is more positive than it would be if we had somebody else in that position.
Yeah.
She is phenomenal at trying to talk people down and working with them and maintaining a very positive attitude. And when people come in, she always is smiling, and rather than being combative or anything of that nature or getting cranky, she doesn't do that. She keeps a smile on her face as she walks people through the process. And I really want to give credit for Heather, because I don't think we would be as successful without her.
So curious, when people come in to talk with her, do they have to have an appointment, or do they just show up and bombard her?
They just show up. I mean, they could schedule an appointment. Typically, they just show up at any point in time, and either Heather, Martha, or I can go out and help them. For the most part, Heather's been doing that.
Any other questions? Mr. Volpe?
So we're dancing around this idea of closure because you haven't had to do it yet. And it seems to me like the case, I'm not sure that people should be living in a building that might fall down, but I'm not the one making the decision. Do you have any idea what would trigger that?
Trigger the relocation?
Yeah.
Well, the one that I showed you, the 5607 Boston Avenue, was very close. We actually had the building inspector, we had the fire marshal. Hey, there we go. I don't know why I did that. Strange. So the building official went out and determined that fire separation was fairly insignificant based on what
The illegal work that they
the illegal work that they had performed to put it back together. So it's one of those things where that one, had they not done what they did, she probably would have shut that one down immediately, at least a number of units. What's going to happen is they're going to have to pretty much tear that building apart and put it back together and get permits to do so. But there are some units out there that I do foresee are going to fail, and it's typically, we don't shut them down for I mean, even if they failed probably half of the things on the inspection checklist, they may not necessarily be building closure checklists, but when you're looking at ceilings falling down and fire separation, that's where we get pretty serious and we'll shut them down. So I do anticipate seeing some of that pretty quick.
Mr. Bokey, I thought for sure on this particular one, Lakewood Estates, that it was going to fail.
Yeah.
And I was surprised that the building official and fire marshal indicated that they've done just enough to get them through.
So in their case, they have enough empty apartments where they can, because what you're showing me is there's dry rot, so it looks to me like.
That was a unit, that one that was significant, that was vacant. It has units that are on the sides of it that are not, however.
Okay, so they're gonna have to be moving people around because they've got to replace whole joists or whatever the case may be.
Yeah, that building's gonna require all kinds of structural assessment too, so before they can even do any repairs, they're gonna have to get an engineer out there and actually assess that building to see what's damaged and what's not, so they're gonna have to remove.
It's also two structures out there, so there might be some tenants in the worst building that go to the other building while they perform the work.
Any other questions? Thank you.
Thank you.
Throw wood at it. Let's see. Now we move to review of engineering and pavement standards with Ms. Kelly Fong.
Good evening, Mayor, Deputy Mayor, council members. I'm here tonight to present a follow-up to the May 14th presentation on a possible pavement degradation fee. As discussed during that meeting, pavement cuts reduce the life cycle of any street regardless of age or condition. So the principle behind a PCI-based pavement degradation fee would be to recuperate future expenses caused by loss of life cycle and premature failure. And I apologize to Councilmember Bokey. At the last meeting, I said that I didn't know of any cities that used a PCI for their fee, and I stand corrected. There's truly nothing new under the sun. So Table A here provides some of the jurisdictions that have pavement degradation fees. And what you can see by the last column on the right is that there is no standard way to assess a pavement degradation fee. Everybody does it slightly different, and some jurisdictions do actually use the pavement condition index. Palo Alto is one of those, and I've provided Palo Alto's pavement condition pavement condition index-based pavement degradation fee. That is a mouthful. So a PCI-based PDF, that is easier to say, could be based on the PCI score, the road classification, and the road composition. What you're seeing here on graph 1 is the critical PCI, and that is typically the tipping point at which pavement begins to show significant increase in deterioration rates, and preventative costs quickly escalate, which ultimately increases financial liabilities for the city. The city's interest is therefore to keep its road network at or above this critical PCI, and the critical PCI is commonly a score of 70 to 50. This is a somewhat simplistic model, but Attachment C does provide studies that have been performed by other jurisdictions that show how pavement cuts have led to loss of serviceability of roadways. The pavement studies that are in Attachment C show a range of loss anywhere from 14 to 56%. The City of Lakewood's engineering manual does call out that a pavement cut could reduce a roadway up to 30 points in PCI, which based on this simplistic model could range anywhere from 14 to 70%. So what I'm showing here on this model is if you had a roadway of 90 and a pavement cut led to a 20-point drop, you would essentially be reducing the roadway from approximately having 10 years of life to having close to 7 years of life. So a PCI-based PDF would allow the city to recover those costs. It's important to note that these figures are not designed to obtain full recovery of damages, but to pay for future damages. So based on that range, what we have set up here is a waterfall for a PDF cost. So if you look on the middle category right here, you'll see that the highest scoring roads, those best performers, those that are typically excellent or good, would have a PDF cost of 50% of what the total reconstruction cost is. So in the right-hand category, you have the reconstruction cost for a concrete roadway, which as a caveat, there aren't too many concrete roadways here in the city. So this is kind of an outlier in this example. But the higher performing streets, those with the higher PCI, would be subject to a higher PDF. As the street rate went down, it would be subject to a lesser extent of the percentage of the total PDF cost. The city here came up with two models. Table D is the option number 1, which you can see the PCI scores are in increments of 10 as they decrease, and then the PDF cost decreases in increments of 5% for each category. The second option has slightly larger categories, so the PCI goes from 100 to 85, and this is commonly industry standard for what is a good or excellent road, and then the next category is 84 to 70, which is I believe it's a fair road at that point, satisfactory, and then the next category is fair, and then 49 to 0 would be failing. Something to note about these two systems is that any road under 50 would not be subject to a PDF. It's at 0%. So any failing streets wouldn't require a pavement degradation fee. The second thing that the PCI PDF could be based on is road composition.
Before you move on from that, where do the percentages come from? Because they don't appear to be linked directly to useful life or time left before it hits 50.
So the percentages come from, again, because those range of studies have quite a range, anywhere again from 14 to 70%. In the studies specifically to 50%, we set it up in a way that it would decrease based on the PCI score. The city could definitely do additional studies on roadway conditions in Lakewood to determine what those numbers actually are in the future, if this was something you would like us to look into.
Well, so they're essentially arbitrary.
They're within the range of what could be a loss of serviceability.
So if you have a 100% road, useful life, or when it's declined to a 70 is going to, or to a 50 is going to be a certain number of years.
Correct.
How does that percentage in the first column relate to the acceleration? Is it a mathematical formula? Is it an approximation? Is it an average of different municipalities? Where's the number?
Yeah, so if you go back to this slope, one of the things you'll notice is that within the 100 to 90, that's where you're going to have your most significant loss. And then as you continue down, the loss itself of life between years is, in a lower PCI score, is going to be less. And so the theory behind the waterfalling is that as the roads decline, you would pay less of the overall for those top performing streets. So for example, if I cut into a roadway that had a 60 PCI and it reduced it to a 50 PCI, based on this kind of average model, you're really losing about a year of serviceability.
And and the useful life is 15.75? Is that the
Yeah, this is based on a model that for asphalt, that a service life should be 20 years.
Okay. Mr. Volkey.
Thank you, Mayor. So are you using 20 years as your ultimate, or the 15.75?
The model is assuming 20 years.
The model is assuming 20 years, okay. So when you're at 70, you're assuming you've got
Approximately 7 years of life.
7 years of life. So if you bring it down to 50, you bring it over, and now you lost 2 or 3 years of life.
Correct.
Okay. What are we charging now?
For a fee?
Yeah,
So if a roadway was outside of the moratorium, the only charge would be the right-of-way permit.
wow, okay. So under your, when you go to table D and table E, so which one are you recommending one of these options, or am I stealing your thunder?
We're recommending the option E, so that would be the PDF option 2. And again, that's just because the categories align with industry standard of what is considered a good, excellent, satisfactory, fair, and failing road.
So then is the plan, so utility comes in, and let's say it's 85. So we're gonna say, how much are you tearing up? And not only do I have to fix it, but now I pay this fee based upon 50%.
Correct.
Okay, so this basically becomes, now where does this money go then? What's the plan?
So the plan for this money is that it would go directly back to the roadways.
Okay, and just sit there. And so then, or we could use it would go to the road fund.
Right,
Okay.
right. Not specifically that roadway, but to,
But it would go into
roadway
the
funds.
general road fund, and the idea being that we could use it for maintenance or
correct.
something. So the idea between the 0 and 49 is the road is so bad that it doesn't matter. They're almost doing us a favor by patching it, right? I mean, there's some areas that are like that. Okay, I'm following, thanks.
Mr. Branstetter.
So PCIs for roads are done by road segment. A few hundred yards, whatever, significance of blocks. So I don't see anything here that talks about if somebody is making a cut so that they can be an electrical line or to fix a line to a residence, okay, in other words. I'm trying to understand how a 1 yard cut, maybe something that's a foot wide by 9 feet long, how that really gets, that's a lot different in terms of degradation than if, like the water district is running down Lake Silicon Drive right now, where they're gonna do something 2 feet wide the entire length of the roadway laterally, as opposed to a house that was built nearby that made a cut across a road to run an underground electrical line over to a new house. That, I don't see how we say that the impact is the same per square yard on that, because we're gonna go to the next year, and in one case, that the PCI of that segment isn't gonna change. If there was a 1 yard cut somewhere along that segment sometime, whereas if there was a 200 square yard cut, yeah, maybe we would, but I don't see any allowance for that. There's just an assumption that if you do something by a square foot, I mean, it's like, we do more degradation by repairing potholes in the way that we do it, where we cut pavement and put patches in than some of these really smaller cuts. So was there any consideration to saying, while there is a square yard fee, the fee starts when you do 20 square yards, as opposed to one, to be able to go and do that? Because one could even not necessarily be a utility company that's doing it. Is someone getting a right-of-way permit for a variety of things that have to do that. Because we're really not going to impact the PCI with a cut of 1 or 2 yards on a particular roadway segment.
So there have been some cities that do have a threshold of size, but I think the argument for anytime you cut into the roadway is you put seams that have to be closed, and those seams inevitably will allow moisture and water in and begin to degrade around the seams.
Okay, so, and I guess our current practice is we have a right-of-way permit fee. What's the difference in the costs between what we're doing now and what this would do? And other than it's always better to have more money than less, I guess, why change other than to get more money?
Sure, so the right-of-way fee is to cover the administrative costs of, say, the inspector and the review of the permit itself. It's not to pay for long-term damage, which the PDF would be set up to do.
So, do you have an example in the city of a road segment that we've had to repair and replace or do something to that where we feel that pavement cuts were the problem that caused the hastening of it? For instance, we just chip sealed much of Oak Brook within the past number of years. When I lived in Oak Brook, there were, going back 15 years, occasions of where there were cable companies that came, and there were some things done by the Puget Sound Energy came and did some things. And we have chip sealed those roads. They never really got down below the point where chip sealing them wasn't an economical solution to bring them back up, and they're in pretty good shape. We've done that out in Lake City just this summer to be able to go and do that on roads that had experienced pavement cuts in the past, but that didn't see where there was a road that we were thinking we were going to have to fix it 15 years from now, and suddenly we have to do it now because pavement cuts have caused the degradation. I mean, while I understand we'd have more money in the road fund doing it this way, do we have real examples of problems?
I would call up Weston Ott, the capital projects manager, for a specific example, but I would also defer back to the research that shows that the presence of pavement cuts, in addition to the volume and size of these cuts, have been shown to lead to loss of serviceability of roadways in other jurisdictions. But for specific examples, I would defer to Weston Ott.
So I think what you're saying, though, is based on research, this is like a car that gets 120,000 miles instead of 200,000 miles because oil changes accelerate the degradation of the engine. It isn't that it wrecks it right away, it's just you don't get the useful life out of it. And therefore, we're renting the car to utility companies. It's the same analogy because we're letting them use the right of way, and they aren't paying full freight. They're patching it, but they're costing us extra money as they use it. So it's talking about raising the rent on the people who use the right of way.
Yeah.
Is that-
Mr. Mayor,
Mr. Volkey.
if I may, I can actually speak to the Oak Brook. Where I am, the roads were built to a different standard because it was a newer area. So it wasn't it was real asphalt, right? A number of years ago now. So that was built in 1991 or 90, 91, right in there. And the only thing that's occurred, and we didn't need to get chip sealed, it's held up, but Click came through, I don't know, 10, 15 years ago now, and did a small trench. It didn't even seem like it was very deep when I watched them do it, but they did the entire neighborhood, right? And that is the only, and I mean, they dug a trench, and then on either side, they put the tar. And I think the cities probably had to come back and redo that tar because it's separated after a while, you know, that it doesn't cover the crack anymore. It just wears itself out. I don't know how it works. So it has degraded the road. Otherwise, I would have still a pristine road without any, because there's not much traffic on it. And that degraded the road, and I don't know how much time we lost, you know, because of that, because we're even with that, we're pushing out close to 30 years, right? Is that what we are? Yeah. So that's an example.
Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. Thank you. How do I want to start this? If the electric company puts another line into my house, and they have to cut across my lawn, they have to repair the lawn. If that same electric company cuts across the road in order to increase service, which what I assume would increase profitability, why shouldn't they have to pay 100% for the road like they do my lawn? And that's my question. You correctly said, in a sense, the review of the literature shows as 50% demarcation. Did the studies also show where it's 75, 80, 85, 100%? Because again, I go back to my rather simplistic analogy. If you, as my neighbor did just a week ago, had a cable come from the box behind my house to his house, the cable company had to go through his lawn. They have to restore that at 100%. Why doesn't that apply to city streets paid for by people like my neighbor?
So in that case, the utility provider would be repairing the streets, and in addition to covering the cost of the repair of the street, they would also be paying any pavement fee. One way I've seen cities get to what you're, I believe, getting to is by creating a warranty clause, which would have utilities come back within a year if they didn't meet the standards after one freeze-thaw cycle, and redo it if there was any blemishes or cracking. And that warranty would continue until it passes a certain period of time.
Would we be wise to consider such a warranty if we're offering 50% of the rent?
Absolutely.
Is that in this?
Yes.
Good. Thank you.
Are you proposing this to replace having a moratorium? Because I notice you have a fee for very high-quality streets all the way up to 100. And so is this in lieu of having a cut moratorium on streets in the city?
This would be in addition to having a cut moratorium. And the idea, again, is we want to reduce cuts in our newer pavement with the moratorium. But with the PDF, we also want to reduce cuts in performing streets. So if your street is still a high performer after 5 years, we want to make sure that, you know, unnecessary cuts are not made into that pavement. So in addition to PCI score, the PDF could also be based on road composition. And to kind of continue with the mayor's analogy of the car, you have some cars that are, say, Toyotas and some cars that are Acuras. So the idea here is to create two road classification categories. You'd have the flexible and the rigid. The flexible being those Toyotas, so that's the hot mix asphalt, and on average, the HMA per ton costs less and lasts a shorter period of time. It's also the predominant material here in the city. The rigid is the Acura, so that's the Portland cement concrete. It typically costs a little bit more. You also typically need more material in concrete roadways. So it costs a bit more per tonnage, and you're gonna need more volume of those roads, or material, excuse me. In addition to the PCI score, the road composition, it would be further broken down into road classification. So we recommend creating two categories, one being high volume corridors, so these would be all of the arterials, and the second category being medium to low volume corridors. And the reason it's broken down into these two categories, again, goes back to the material necessary to redo these streets. As you can see, there is quite a bit of difference between the material needed for a high volume and a medium-low volume. And so your rate per yard is going to be higher for the streets that require more materials. So this is just a page that shows basically the materials that would be necessary per square yard. So if you were to do a concrete arterial, you would be required to have that much concrete material per square yard. So that's how we came across the numbers to set the pavement degradation fee. And again, the total cost of the square footage is the cost for that per square yard. And then the pavement degradation fee is the 50%. It starts at the 50% and then reduces as the PCI gets lower. So when you put that all together, you have option 1 and option 2 listed here. So again, your higher performing streets are going to have the 50% across the board. And that is, again, going back to that last slide, the 50% of the total cost of reconstruction. And you can see it for both options 1 and options 2.
Question for you. Good. Mr. Whalen, maybe I missed it. What's our mechanism to adjust the prices for material as time goes on?
So currently, the city for the moratorium fee adjusts the price based on the price of the material during that quarter. So the fee itself, I would imagine, or recommend, I should say, be adjusted on a yearly basis based on the cost of the material.
So I think we've got a fee schedule that we review every 2 years. Might that be incorporated by reference?
Absolutely.
into that process?
Absolutely. So the city currently doesn't have too much information on pavement cuts that go on beyond moratorium. So I just used a few pavement cuts from 2015 to 2017 that were done in moratorium streets, just to show, for example, what a PDF fee might look like. So you can see the roadway, the PCI score, how large the dimensions of the cut were. And on the note of the cut, it's not just the cut, but the area of influence, which is the 3 feet on either side of the trench, the square yardage, and then over on the far right hand, you can see what the PCI score is. I will note there's one mistake here, that 68 should have a 5 in front of it. And this is an example of what I was just walking through, is you would have your influence area. In this case, it's an 8x24 section in a PCI roadway of 78 on a high volume with HMA material at a cost of 36.04 per square yard, which for your cut would come to a total of $768.73. So a few other things with the pavement degradation fee. The city recommends that Roadways earmarked are funded for reconstruction in the city's capital improvement plan, and streets with a PCI score of 50 or lower, so this is typically what is considered failing, would be exempt from having to pay a pavement cut fee. And this again goes back to the idea of those roadways are going to be replaced or should soon be replaced. Emergency work.
So to make sure I understand that, for instance, Veterans Drive, which is in our CIP to be replaced. If someone did a cut on that, there wouldn't be a PDF.
Correct. If it was fully funded in the CIP, then there would be no degradation fee on that.
Well, the CIP doesn't fund anything. The CIP lists projects and projects costs and funding to be able to go and do that. I mean, Mr. Rod always tells us there are numbers that are estimates about what projects will cost, and there are more projects than money in the CIP to be able to go and do that. But if it's in the 6-year CIP, then it wouldn't be looking at a PDF. So for instance, Onyx Drive, where we're looking to do that. Washington Boulevard, Stelicum Boulevard, which are the current major things in our CIP now. And some Gravelly Lake Drive, the parts that aren't having the trail done this year. So it seems that we're going to that'll become an element of the, and when we say the CIP, we're talking the 6-year tip. I guess I'm trying to understand what is what we're talking about here, because transportation, I'm used to seeing the tip. You know, in the budget, there's a CIP.
Maybe Mr. Ott can clue us in here. Funding, yeah.
So initially, we had a discussion, should it be the 6-year TIP, Transportation Improvement Program, or the Capital Improvement Program that's part of the budget? And as you correctly pointed out, in the TIP, there's projects that even though they may be shown in the next 6 years, we may or may not have funding for that. So the determination was, if it is a project that is funded, then that would be one that they would exclude. So I'm trying to, a good example of one would be the recent John Dower Safe Routes to School project from Stelicum to Custer. It would have scored both in that 50 or lower, and it was in our capital improvement plan. So therefore, if a utility came in, they would trench cut, repair it, pay their right-of-way permit fee, and go about their business. But really what Shannon is getting at here is our roads that we've put a significant investment into is protecting that investment.
So here, are we talking about a 2-year, I mean, it's within the current biennium budget? Is that what we're talking when we say the CIP, or are we talking a 6-year projection? I mean,
I think that would be open for further discussion. Is it the next 2 years or 6 years? But what we were trying to get at was something that would be, you know, not guaranteed funded, because nothing's guaranteed, but something that funding would be anticipated. It would be secured funding.
I mean, because one of the things we've talked on a number of occasions about wanting to do is to get utilities to do work in conjunction with our road projects, as opposed to immediately after, or even immediately before, tear them up, so we can come and tear them up in 2 years to be able to go and do that. And you don't think that this would incentivize the water district or someone to say, well, they're gonna tear that road up in 2020, let's go do our work now in 2018.
I don't think it would necessarily be an incentive. Couple examples for Puget Sound Energy, they have certain pipe that has to be repaired because they found different lots of pipe are subject to failure. And so if they know that ahead of time and they also know that we have a road project, that'd be a great opportunity for them to get in and pothole, make sure it is that pipe that needs replaced and do the replacement. Same with Water District. If Water District has their capital plan figured out and that can align with our transportation plan, it's another good example of partnering. And I will say the utilities are doing a much better job of partnering with us. And the city hosts a quarterly coordination meeting with all the utilities. And then the outcome of the notes from that all get emailed out. So even if they don't attend, they get them. And we go over everything from what's in the tip all the way to current construction as well as private development. And we always have one of the engineers from the department there. So we're doing a lot better.
Okay, and has this proposal been discussed with the utilities at one of the quarterly meetings?
Absolutely. We'll get to that in 2 slides, I believe.
Oh, okay.
So in addition, the city also recommends, let me just go, for emergency work, because any pavement cut does prematurely deteriorate city streets, to not preclude emergency work from a PDF. We would recommend that, the emergency work be performed, and then after the emergency work, within a certain period of time, the utility come in and pay for the pavement degradation fee. We also think that by not requiring emergency work to be subject to a PDF, it could have the effect of decreasing the collaboration, which we are hoping to engender with utility providers. We also recommend a work warranty, and this is what I mentioned a little bit earlier, that the city add a requirement that all patches and pavement have a warranty period of 1 year. So if any rehabilitation work was performed and the patch failed to meet city standards, the utility would have to come back and redo that patch. Some warranty covered defects are listed there. And if that company did have to come back out to redo their work, then the warranty would be extended for an additional year on top of the first year.
Mr. Whalen. Sure. It raises an interesting question. So when a utility goes and does the remediation and repair work, are they required to select a contractor that's already been vetted by the city, licensed, bonded, experienced in doing this kind of work, or can they pick any Yahoo, get the work done, but it's subject to the warranty?
We'll have to get back to you on that, but typically the corrections are either made by the utility themselves, or everything I've seen, they bring in a quality company.
So is it often that utility companies actually have crew that can do some of this work themselves?
It really depends. When it comes to pavement, they'll bring in asphalt patch or Puget Paving or some of those other companies that are really good at that small range projects.
Okay.
Those are the ones that typically bring in, because they don't want to come back and repair.
Right. So it hasn't been a historic issue for us. Okay. Sorry, Jim. Mr. Simpson.
Thank you, Mayor. Going back to our warranty discussion, let's say we have some road work done, it's patched, it fails in that first year. The utility that did the work is therefore obligated to fix it, and then that warranty extends another year, correct?
Correct.
What if it fails a second time? Does it continue to recycle out?
Correct.
Okay. How is this advantageous to the utility and or the city? Would it not be wiser to say you warranty your work for 5 to 10 years, or the remaining time on that piece of road before it drops to 70?
That is an interesting concept, and I think we can discuss that in further detail.
I mean, I'm no engineer here, but it seems to me that if I buy a car, I don't go from year to year to year. So if I'm buying something from a utility company, why should I do the same?
What if the road, Ms. Chan, what if the road has got, not 5 or greater years left, maybe 4, and they warranty it for the year, getting you to 5?
Then I suspect we could build something into our warranty policy that would reflect the age or the usefulness of the road, and we pick 70 as that low water mark.
I think it's a fascinating idea, and I'd like to look into it some more. Yeah, absolutely.
Is Mr. Gentleman from PSC, you really want to sit up here with us? I'm just messing with you, sir. I mean, I saw him out here.
So Councilmember Brandstetter asked about the utility meeting coordination. We did hold a special meeting on July 17th for all of the utility providers. An email was sent out to them, and we had a showing, I believe, of around 12 at this meeting. And we went over the concept of the PDF and, you know, why the city was looking into this. Some questions and concerns that were raised were many of the questions that you have brought up tonight. For example, you know, what is this going to cost us? What about previous street distress, and where would those monies be set aside for? So as far as implementation, what the city could do is amend the City of Lakewood engineering standards, and I've included this as attachment D. Then create a process for PDFs and apply them to any persons making cuts within the public right-of-way. One comment we did hear from a utility provider was that if you're going to create this process, just roll it into the right-of-way permit. And I've actually seen several other jurisdictions that do that, so they have a pavement cut section where you give the dimensions, and it's pretty streamlined. And then third step would be if this was part of the right-of-way or its own separate process, but that these applications would be made to and reviewed by the Public Works and Engineering Department for approval. So recommendations, again, the city recommends establishing a PDF based on option 2, which are the broader categories, not exempting emergency work, but exempting roadways earmarked to reconstruction, exempting roadways with a PCI less than 50, requiring a 1-year warranty, and implementing the PDF as described on the last slide. Any additional questions?
That's all. Oh, very thorough. Good.
Thank you.
Made sense. One errata, if you're going to borrow my analogy, Toyota goes to Lexus, not Acura.
Ah. Is Acura Honda then? I was close.
Yeah.
I was never a car person, so I apologize.
We now move to a review of MCI Metro Access franchise agreement. Mr. Busich.
And good evening, Mayor Anderson, Deputy Mayor Wallen, City Council. After the long, lengthy conversation on PDFs, I think this conversation on the MCI Metro, AKA Verizon, non-exclusive franchise agreement should be fairly quick. In your packet was a brief memo that described what they're looking to do along with a proposed ordinance for, or excuse me, a franchise in the ordinance, allowing them to operate a telecommunications services through, over, and under the rights-of-way of the City of Lakewood. We currently have 3 similar non-exclusive franchise agreements, Zayo, Integra, and Astound. We've taken a look at those and taken a look at this one. They're all very similar. Does not appear it would adversely impact the city rights-of-way. There are a significant number of protections in the franchise agreement that protects our infrastructure. We are recommending that you authorize the city manager to bring the final ordinance forward authorizing MCI Metro to provide the telecommunication services in the city of Lakewood as reflected in the attached proposed ordinance.
Any questions?
Is this the first small cell franchise we're doing?
I'm sorry?
Mr. Whalen?
Checking with the mayor outside here. Is this the first small cell franchise that we would be approving?
This actually is exclusive of microcell minor facilities and small cell facilities and antennas. It is specifically excludes
them.
those.
I see it, okay, on the top of page 141. All right.
So this is just coextensive with the existing non-exclusive franchises?
Correct.
We've never had one before with this group?
Not with this particular group. Or at least not under this name. Now, MCI Metro, AKA Verizon, when you take a look at what we have on record, it's these three, Zayo, Integra, and Astound. So they're branching into another area.
And they're typically going to be doing their work on the poles, existing poles, as opposed to street cuts. We just had a nice conversation
Correct.
about that.
Where we have areas where all the utilities are to be put underground, they would put it underground. If they happen to come into an area and cut our roadway, should we go forward with the proposal you heard earlier, they would also be subject to that. It's also very clear that the poles that we do not own, that we hang our own equipment on, owned by Tacoma Public Utilities and others, we are not giving them license to do that because we don't have the authority to do that. They would need to negotiate themselves with those utilities.
Any other questions? Well, seems pretty straightforward. Thank you.
Thank you very much.
We now have Ms. Wachter for a review of indemnification code amendments. After this one. And we're gonna have one set.
Good evening, Mr. Mayor, Deputy Mayor, members of the council, Heidi Wachter, City Attorney. This matter has been before you previously for consideration, and it goes to the question of indemnifications, trying to essentially find the sweet spot between having your employees feel confident in dispatching their duties regardless of potential threats of litigation, and not shelling out taxpayer dollars for conduct that we don't condone or didn't direct. So in reviewing this, you have seen a myriad of different approaches by different jurisdictions. And what we're presenting tonight is found on page 158 of your packet, and it essentially says that what we would prefer is to try and catch these times when the city might be exposed to a situation dealing with an employee who could be tagged for punitive damages, try to flag those early on and do our own investigation into the situation and make our own determination. And the one question that comes from the proposed language is, okay, let's suppose you do your investigation and you determine you are going to cover these city officials. And it may not be police officers, it could be a flagger at one of our construction sites who's accused of not doing his flagging job and the worst happens. So we do our investigation and determine that we're going to cover. What if later evidence reveals that the conduct wasn't as we found in our investigation? Well, the answer is at some point, if we're confronted with evidence that suggests the employee was not in fact acting in the scope of their employment, we still would have a reservation of rights letter placed on it with this amended language. So there's not a silver bullet in this type of situation. What we're aiming for is something that the council feels comfortable with, that finds that sweet spot. If I haven't hit it, I am confident you will tell me that. And with that, I will open it to any questions you may have.
Questions? Mr. Polk.
Just a quick question about on page 166, the table. Could you explain that to us? The Lakewood.
The terrible, horrible table. I was really proud of it when I first did it.
I actually do appreciate the work, but I just don't know what the X's mean.
Yeah, the X's mean those are elements that we found in these different codes. And the real point of it isn't necessarily with regard to the detail of each code. It was that as I went through each city's code, and in some cases, cities don't adopt codes at all, they just go with the state law. It became apparent that there's not a theme. And I will tell you, after 30 years of doing this, an awful lot of the time, if the council's asking for an ordinance, I can call MRSC and I will get a boilerplate type of ordinance for a particular circumstance, and just about every city follows that type of ordinance. This type of ordinance, indemnification, does not fit that mold, and that's really the point of that chart.
So the Lakewood portion, that's what you're proposing? Because
No, that's
currently-
what currently exists.
Okay, so how will it look after?
After, you would have coverage based on in the scope would be better addressed, and it would be more clear from the get-go that the council had agreed after an investigation that the employee was acting within the scope. It would not include coverage contingent on the judgment. It would allow and it would clarify that the council was going to authorize punitive damages, which you can do now, but it would be at an earlier stage. One of the themes that I got in listening to the council when we discussed this earlier wasn't so much the concern about paying punitive damages, even though that's never a pleasant thing. It was the idea that it came so late in the game. It didn't give the council the ability to look at this without the cloud of a judgment over it. And the new language would require that when we see these types of cases come out, and the way I would describe it is just about any time we have a death that's resulted from it, where city conduct has been involved, whether it's a construction site, police activity, anything like that, we would do our own investigation. And I would tell you the parallel to this is employment law. If you have an employee engaged in misconduct, you don't wait for a court to tell you whether that employee was engaged in misconduct, because lots of things can happen at trial. You do your own internal investigation and make your own determination as to whether or not you're going to do something with that employee, based on whether or not it's tied to their employment. So it's trying to create that type of parallel here, but early in the process.
Okay, any other items besides coverage based on the scope and?
Well, what we did, the reservation of rights is clarified. I think you had the ability to do it previously, but this makes it clear that that again is going to be much earlier in the process. I would tell you that a lot of the elements are the same, but the timing is different and it's more clear. So that early on, when you see this type of a situation, you satisfy yourselves. Some cases, it's going to be a matter of turning it over to another jurisdiction. Some cases, it might be a bigger deal than that, and you bring in some other type of investigator to do it. It's going to vary depending on what the case looks like. And if we don't know from the incident itself, Washington, we typically are served with a claim that we're allowed 60 days before the lawsuit can be commenced.
So I'll ask you a very unlawyerly question. Last sentence in B. Under no circumstances will the city indemnify individual employees for conduct outside the scope of employment for the city of Lakewood. Says who?
Well, that's a very lawyerly question, and that would go to the question of if something changed along the way, we would be able to use that language to say our investigation found this. Somewhere in the trial, a specific piece of evidence, not what the jury did, not the ruling, but there's a specific piece of evidence that was not considered in the investigation. If we have an employee that we would find is not acting in the scope of employment, did something not directed by us, not condoned by us, not in keeping with their job, and that was part of this, the city would not indemnify. But you're right, beauty is in the eye of the beholder. And sometimes whether something's in the scope of employment is in the eye of the beholder. We could have
who makes the determination?
Pursuant to the investigation, there would be a recommendation coming to the council that the council would then pass on. It's not so much that the council.
But then this seems chronologically later.
Okay.
Under no circumstances. So we make a determination, under this, we make a determination, yeah, we have a reservation of rights, we're gonna indemnify whatever our determination is. And then at the end we go, whoa, we found out you were like way out. You're way out there.
What I would liken it to, this might not be a very good analogy, but it's a change order. It's a change order. You come in and you say, this doesn't look the way that it looked at the outset, and there's a specific thing that changes the analysis. We come back to the council with that and say, as a matter of fact, this is not within the scope. One of the areas that falls in the scope that is sometimes uncomfortable, and I know that this specifically happens in the police department, there's a type of finding you can get where the employee did exactly what they were supposed to be doing, and we later learn that it was a policy or a procedure specifically adopted by the department that really wasn't the right policy or procedure, or we've learned now doesn't work the way that we had wanted it to work. So it's not so much that the employee was outside the scope, it still isn't something that the city wanted done that way necessarily.
But it doesn't change the fact the city has taken a proactive stance to this from the beginning, which is what I hear you say. Rather than the city being reactive, you have already established the groundwork for proactive behavior. And if there's a change, at least we can argue, we've already begun that investigation. And I think, if I'm understanding this, that's part of the sweet spot you're looking for.
It is. I would say, though, that the question that the mayor and the deputy mayor seem to be getting at is the question of when does the circle stop? If you're putting in that sentence, under no circumstances would we indemnify for conduct outside the scope. If we've already made the determination, is there a point where we've drawn a hard line on that?
Here you say, so everything comes back to us, and you say, yes, we will pay punitive damages. And then you say, whoa, we didn't know that.
Know about that. Yeah.
And is that us making the determination?
It would be us bringing back the recommendation, and the reason for that is that the allocation of the resources, not specifically out of what line item, but the fact that we're going to pay would have to be a decision made by the council.
And then at that point, the only way you have punitive you don't have punitive damages in a settlement, you have punitive damages in a lawsuit.
Correct.
So there's a judgment in a lawsuit which we have been a party, and an adverse finding that somebody did that within the scope of their employment. How can we independently find at that point that it was outside the scope of employment? Aren't we stopped?
Once you've already made the decision that it is within?
So we made a decision that that we would indemnify for punitive damages.
Mm-hmm.
Jury makes a decision, says they were city's liable because they were acting within the scope of their employment, and awards punitive damages because it was outrageous conduct, whatever. So we made a determination that we're pay punitive damages. And jury confirms it. We decide, well, this really wasn't within the scope of employment.
Right.
We don't want to pay.
Right.
I don't see how we can change the path at that point.
I think that is one option, is to take that sentence out and just stand by the earlier decision. What that could leave you with is a situation where what was found in the investigation at some point is exposed to have missed something. It's just a question of where you want to put the flag in the sand and say, this is where we'll stand by the decision. I definitely was mindful of the concern that the council had, and it's a valid concern, that city resources not be paid out for conduct outside the scope of employment or misconduct. So if we've decided early in the stage, we've done a thorough investigation, the council's satisfied that it's a thorough investigation, and truly most times we know things better close to the incident than we do years down the road. It could stand that way.
Mr. Whalen.
So I got a few little questions here. First line, are we intentionally excluding officials from the scope of this paragraph simply because they likely don't take actions that could give rise to punitive damages.
There was no such intent, and I think officials would be a good addition to that paragraph.
I'm just thinking about Mr. Simpson's benefit. Okay, John, this is to cover you, okay? So, yeah. Again, city officials or employees, that was my first question on there. Then, with regard to, you might want to get some coffee for that caffeine thing there. So we're going to issue a reservation of rights, second clause there, to each individual employee may be exposed. I think if you look at the prior paragraph, it might be more clear to say that the city shall undertake an officer's or employee's defense.
Subject to.
Right, a reservation
Got
of
it.
rights to such individuals or whatever who may be exposed to individual liability. Just to be clear about, we're gonna defend you, but it's gonna be under reservation of rights, because then it raises the issue potentially down the road that if someone has been determined to have an action or to have taken some act that may be subject to reservation of rights, what the hell is going on? They may want to get their own independent counsel.
Correct. They would know better than, yeah. Correct.
Yeah, so that was my thought. I'm trying to figure out how we bring in provisions of some of the other statutes that gave us as examples. For example, the Bottom Lake, let's take one of them, which was their 252.040. Do we need to have language, for example, looking at that sample statute, which is repeated in some of the other jurisdictions, even in subparagraph C, where they've added, provided however, the provision for payment by the city of punitive damages on behalf of the city official or employee under this chapter shall not be construed as a waiver of civil immunity. We gotta add that language in there. So those are my thoughts. Cleaning that paragraph up.
Yep.
So right now, the elevation.
I'll bring this back next Monday then. Yes, that helped tremendously. Thank
Mr.
you.
Brandt?
If we were to adopt this ordinance, where is the line between when it's effective? And by that I mean, if somebody did something last week, okay, and ultimately a year from now, there's a claim and it goes through and do that. When the employee was performing whatever he was doing and was relying on the indemnification ordinance that was in effect at the time, or does this ordinance go back retroactively to any prior acts that might come up for, and there be a claim against the city on? I just didn't see any language regarding that in the ordinance.
The retroactivity. I would see this as prospective, and what it would mean is from today forward, when those incidents are made known to the city, that, so for example, if there were such a collision that somehow was coming back against some of our flagmen at a construction scene for a roadway or something like that, we would investigate that if it came in today. I am not aware of any going back. The most recent of our litigation cases that would fit this is going into mediation at this stage. I mean, we're far beyond that point, but I could certainly take it up with council.
Well, I guess I don't know of every action every city employee has taken in the past that has perhaps irritated someone that may at some point bring it forward. that if there could be something that makes it clear that this applies to actions of employees as of the date of the ordinance, or if it should be, this applies to, in any situation where a claim is made after this date, which would then go back a ways, but be clear one way or the other.
Okay. Thank you.
Take a 5-minute comfort break before we sub-area plan. we now move to a review of the downtown sub-area plan. It's like, how do you eat an elephant? A bite at a time. And so maybe the first bite is, we had a couple absent members of the council. We could do a quick overview for them and then try to see how much we'll put on our plate. After that, we'll see how much we want to put on our plate for tonight and chew on it. Mr. Buer or Ms. Beer?
Why don't you go with the overview first?
Okay. Thank you, Mr. Mayor and members of the council. Tiffany Spear, Project Manager for Special Projects at the City of Lakewood. This is the third time, I think, the council has taken up in some way the Downtown Sub-Area Plan packet. And when I say packet, I refer to 4 items. There is a downtown plan itself. There's a downtown development code, which is associated with implementing that plan. There are amendments proposed to the comprehensive plan in order to incorporate the downtown plan. And then there are changes to Title 18A to reflect what's going on within that as well. And then the last piece is a planned action ordinance, which is an EIS for anticipated full build-out under whatever alternative is ultimately decided on by council to adopt, but up to what's called Alternative 2, and that's the highest density of both jobs and housing units within the downtown sub-area. So 2 weeks ago, there was a study session at which you were provided a lengthy presentation, and I'm by no means going to be repeating myself this evening with this overview, but that material was provided to you both on the 9th and then on the 16th when there was a public hearing. You had a few people testify, all of which were positive comments, and then there's been a number of written comments submitted that were addressed either prior to that public hearing or what you saw last week. I'm sorry, I'm getting mixed up on my dates. There was a comment provided, yes, excuse me, at the 16th, the joint study session with the council and the planning commission by Commissioner Guerrero. And in tonight's packet, you have a response memo, which includes information replying to Mr. Guerrero's comments, as well as responses to questions that were voiced by the council, either on the 9th or on the 16th. So there's a couple of ways that we could go about this. The mayor just mentioned trying to break it up into logical pieces. One way to do it is to simply ask you if you have questions based on the memo provided for this evening or anything out of that PowerPoint that you might want to touch on. The other way might be to just walk through each of the 4 pieces, meaning is there anything out of the plan itself you want to cover, and then move on to whatever other documents, the development code, comprehensive plan amendments, or the planned action ordinance, or whatever the council's pleasure may be.
I think we need to concentrate on the plan itself as opposed to Title 18, which is an implementation aspect.
Okay.
And that rather than go for wide-ranging questions, we would probably want to take it in some sections. And perhaps even before that, we can maybe address that I haven't had time to look at, Mr. Guerrero's comments on what the responses are.
Okay.
So we did have kind of a wide-ranging discussion on that. And since Mr. Guerrero's here, we can pick on him if necessary. Keep him up late.
Excuse me, where, hello, there it is, okay. So what you have then within tonight's memo, the first couple of pages, starting on page 208 of your packet, are responses to your questions. Mr. Guerrero's responses by staff start on page 211. And essentially, would you like me to walk through them piece by piece?
Please.
Okay. So the first question or issue that was raised by Mr. Guerrero referred to the colonial overlays boundaries and whether they were larger or smaller than they needed to be. What the staff has provided for you is information based on public outreach, essentially, where different boundaries were suggested and studied in the 2017 Central Business District Assessment, but the community in its public comments supported colonial design standards beyond just the existing buildings, and so that current boundary that you see is a response to public comment. Should I keep going?
Yes.
Okay. The second one refers also within the colonial district, the design review requirements, and talking about a couple of different things. The types of roofs that might be allowed based on being in the colonial center, and the fact that the examples provided in graphic form don't all comply themselves to what's being required by the development code. The response, which starts on page 212, includes the fact that the suggestion would be, rather than changing out graphics or rewriting that section altogether, simply include a statement that clarifies that the examples are demonstrative and they are not all necessarily 100% compliant. And so you see that language in underlined red text there at the top of page 212.
Why would we have a non-compliant example?
Simply because it's hard to find everything in one picture that's being suggested in the plan. There's pieces of it that were able to be located, but this is a way of trying to explain that there are some things out of each one of these graphics that is going to be incorporated and implemented by the development code.
Help me with gambrel roof. What's a gambrel roof, James?
I would actually turn to Mr. Guerrero.
Is that one of the pictures we're looking at over here? On page 72. The lower left.
Barn?
Gambrel one or
Barn shape?
Barn shape thing?
It's like the Dutch barn kind of thing.
Is that a gambrel roof?
Yes, I think the center photo.
Is that a gambrel roof?
Typically, a gambrel is, has a seat next to the shower, which looks like a traditional barn shape. Those,
This part of it is kind of a parapet.
Yeah.
I was just trying to
This
get,
is the downtown plan itself.
sorry about that.
Actually, the one on the far right, on the, right, no, above it, that looks like from the side.
Oh, yeah,
I think
yeah,
that
yeah.
looks like,
I think you're right.
what you're describing as a barn, like ruin, that looks like that on the far
Colonial
right, yeah.
house. Okay, I got it. I understand my no man Glatcher.
Yes. Then there's also language that discusses the inclusion of flat roofs as part of what's allowed within the colonial district under subsection F sub 5. And then there's also a discussion in that question raised by Mr. Guerrero regarding stucco as a facade material and allowing that up to 50% of total building surface. The thought behind at first not including it at all is simply that stucco is not necessarily, at least historically, a popular facing for buildings in this climate and the weather that we have here. But if products have changed, if preferences have changed, maybe it goes up to 50% of the total building surface. And again, that's not a traditional colonial exterior in any event. So if that's what you're trying to preserve, you don't want necessarily everything in the the colonial district to have stucco.
So what is the response? Is that we would add stucco based on Mr. Guerrero's recommendation, or that we think that that's not appropriate?
The thought behind it originally not be included at all was simply we're going with this idea of a colonial look.
More brick.
Right. And so what you have here is an offer for an amendment based on his comment, given his expertise in the industry, that if that's something that the council wanted to adopt, they certainly could. But the idea behind the 50% limit that's included is that, again, it's not a traditional colonial look. So rather than having the entire, potentially the entire colonial area stucco buildings, maybe you limit it to, it could be another number if you didn't want to use 50.
Well, I guess that I understand that stucco is an option along with these other 4 items here, and there are other things that could be on this list, because there are other options if you want to build something, okay, to be able to go and do that. But that, I really heard from the public, they really want us to drive new development to have colonial appearance. That, as opposed to ease of or cost of construction to be able to go through and do that. And if you start with stucco and then the next person will come in and want a Community Development Department to make at their discretion an exception for being able to go and do that. I just don't know if that's not the first step on a slope to anything. As opposed to being very, very insistent, I guess my thought would be on, let's stay as true to colonial design as we are. We're not Williamsburg, but we're like that neighborhood of the city in respect to the historical piece of it to be able to go and do that. So I'm not sure that I like beginning to add more non-traditional appearing materials.
Mr. Bulkey.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I don't want to get off track here and start debating the actual, but I guess what struck me was the size of the colonial area. I get that people want to preserve the colonial center, and I guess the Columbia Bank building pays some homage to that. After that, there really just isn't much, and there's a reason that people don't build with brick in Western Washington. I mean, I know that there's been some churches built that way, but a lot of the examples that we see would look good. When I lived in Huntsville, Alabama, brick is what's the right word? There's a lot of it, and a lot of people build with brick, and it's a relatively competitive building material. My questions surrounding the colonial area is, number one, why is it so big? Number two, how many development opportunities are we precluding? I mean, if it works and it's a neat area where suddenly you see all these colonial buildings and people really want to do this, but is that a realistic, given that nobody even wants to redevelop either side of the colonial center? And I mean, we can't get people to do the main part. How realistic is it to think that they're going to start building? Oh yeah, I build colonial, sure. I'm going to do that. I guess I'm missing something here, and I'm not excited to be raining on the parade here, but I guess I'm just not getting it.
Isn't this kind of the equivalent of creating a historic building designation for undeveloped properties? I mean, it's akin to that, and unless there's some other incentive, historic building designations generally inhibit development unless they have some sort of tax incentive to go with them. So here, if you say you must have a retro, a zone that has to have a retro construction aspect to it, aren't you inhibiting development? I mean, I've personally been involved in some projects that involve brick, and it's not cheap. It's a rather expensive enhancement, so. Mr. Whalen?
Yeah, two thoughts on that. To the first question, is the zone too large to accommodate what we're trying to address? And I think James has referenced potential concerns of the Goodwill building, which we've heard a little bit, that there may be some other development potentially in that area. The Harborstone buildings, which are pretty darn modern, as it is. And then the Lakewood Dental building, which has a gambrel roof, kinda, but it's pretty far from looking colonial. So should we kind of stick with the thought about the main arterials, Bridgeport, Gravel Lake Drive, Motor Avenue, Mount Tacoma Drive, is kind of that colonial area, and not get too, I hear that's what you're saying, Paul, right? Not get too crazy with the zone for the overlay?
What are you looking at?
This is on our page 211, we're looking at James's comments and the response. And then James, this is a question for you. What's your thought on the stucco? I'm not sure I can come to mind something that's half stucco and half brick, except you see a lot of the modern buildings that have brick or stone or CMU block in the first half, and then,
So this is actually a picture of the Colonial Center, and that actually probably isn't stucco, but it's a flat board that looks like, right?
oh, you're talking about where the
The upper level there above the brick.
sport and spine is?
Yeah, that has a deep, and I think it's probably a board, not actually stucco, but it has to me, it's a.
Stucco look.
Effect, yeah. And so that was what I was using as my example, saying, well, if we have this, if we're matching
Got
it,
it.
that is actually what we want.
Which looks to be 25%.
You know, the Goodwill building presently has a fake metal front. It's not even, it was manufactured off-site, stuck up there. It's a fake, it's a false front on a decrepit old brick building.
Not that I know of.
Yeah, I was gonna say. Yeah, I don't have a huge preference one way or the other on, I think having the 50% stucco recommendation is fine, up to, that's not a huge problem for
I do
me.
too. I think that eclectic approach, if I'm following this, is we're not precluding ourselves by locking ourselves into one design.
Just some
Having
flexibility.
a little more variety is good.
Yeah.
So what I would say is that we don't want to be another Leavenworth. We just want a nice center.
Mhm.
Given the spirit of how this was presented as I remember it from last week, yes. To answer your question.
How about the size? Small.
Where's our map again?
Yeah, what page is that?
What do you think, David?
Well, the colonial overlay zone that was established, which is on page 195, started out smaller. And then what happened was, at the request of some of the public comments, it got bigger. And so that's how it evolved from one size to another. I kind of agree with some of the council member comments here about there's existing buildings that are way off the mark when it comes to a colonial design. You've already talked about which ones. In that regard, it would appear to me that a smaller area might be more appropriate to be more confined to the more historic colonial plaza buildings. So, you know, bringing it up from Lake Grove to Mount Tacoma Drive or thereabouts wouldn't be a bad idea. But those are my comments, of course. It's the council's decision to make.
Down here? Yeah, so you got Mount Tacoma Drive where you got the bank, right? And then, that's not a bad intersection up to, that Bridgeport there, I guess that, yeah, it would be Bridgeport. Well, you've got to Lake Grove, let me think here, so that is at the corner where you got the open lot right now, you got the
Which is
little
gonna
white
which is gonna
buildings.
come in for construction permits very soon, and it's not gonna have a colonial design to it.
On the open lot there?
Mhm.
Who's putting something there?
Mr. Guerrero has a client that's coming in with an apartment complex.
Oh, I know, yeah, that project. I'm talking about the one, the corner that we looked at some time ago, the Harvestone Bank corner. That's what I was talking about, David.
Oh, that one.
Oh, yeah, it would be here.
Would be in this one.
It's like right down Lake Grove. It's right there in the corner, Lake Grove and,
Across the street from,
yeah.
Would the council like us to massage the boundaries a little bit and come back with something?
How many acres is it?
I don't know off the top of my head. There's some basis to extend that design a little further along Gravity Lake Drive to pick up the bank,
Mm-hmm.
and maybe just a few parcels.
Well, you could go to Mount Tacoma Drive, or just slightly beyond it, right?
Well, there's
To the south.
certainly the building behind the Columbia Bank that's going to go away, and whatever replaces it should be
Yeah.
in the district.
I think that makes sense.
Yeah, I'm concerned about making a long-range mistake by, the input's good as suggestions, but I don't think that the majority of people who would like to see a colonial-looking district, like people would like to see Leavenworth, had any basis for an informed economic analysis of whether that can actually happen or not. And so that by doing it, we actually could preclude development instead of encouraging development. So,
I think if they did the cost analysis of brick versus stucco, it just precludes for them not to do it. Which is,
Well, and the other issue, maybe I'm jumping ahead here, but if you've got, how do you mesh a colonial style with a 16-foot first floor looks with glass?
Mr. Whalen, could we hold off on that question right now?
Yeah.
And the reason is because Mr. Guerrero provided his comments. We have since provided him our response.
Right.
He has in turn provided us another letter, which you have not seen, and we have provided a response to that letter. And that goes to some of the questions that you're asking
okay,
right now.
well, let's proceed with your responses here then.
So in other words, I'm timely, but premature.
You're out over your skis.
Yeah.
All right, so the third question that was raised by Mr. Guerrero at page 212 of your packet does relate to first floor heights and transparencies of windows in most of the street and frontage types, and the concern of how that's going to work, and given the fact in particular that there's not many buildings within the city, he states, that meet the standard now. The idea is that watching within the tables which street you're looking at and the type of use you're suggesting, the 16-foot height and the 70% transparency may or may not apply. So for instance, if you were going with residential multifamily on the ground floor, you probably wouldn't use a frontage type that would require that type of transparency. So it would, the developer would need to be looking at what type of frontage do I want to be able to do on whatever street I'm located on, and does it make sense to have that requirement or not? So within the Colonial District, again, there have also already been a reduction of that 70% down to 50% based on the discussion at the Planning Commission level. One suggestion that did come out of his comment, though, was a need to actually add the little table there in red that you see on page 213, because this was inadvertently left out. And so this is talking about window transparencies for the plaza frontage type. And again, this gets at when and where you're going to need to do 60, 50, none transparency requirements, depending on the street that you're on. Also part of that answer is discussing the need to have plaza landscaping required when you're on a plaza frontage. So that was the response from staff for the third issue.
This gets, again, discussed in another piece of correspondence which we will provide at your study session.
Weather protection, Mr. Guerrero raised the issue of the need to make sure that the process to apply for and get approval for weather protection extending into the public right-of-way be very simple and with a standard form, and absolutely no objection from staff regarding that. So that's something that the city would be developing once this was moving toward implementation.
Got it.
The civic uses, the question was, why is there a series of exceptions there within the code? There are civic uses identified for conditional use permit approval at 18A35, 220, and 400, because that's the current process. And also, given the unique nature of civic uses, the idea was to make sure that their design would reflect what they are, a civic use, and that would continue to use a conditional use permit review process. This also incorporated, what's in the code right now, incorporated language that was suggested by representatives from the Pierce County Libraries that attended the 2018 Developer Forum.
I didn't see anywhere where there was a definition of civic use.
Do you know if there's one?
Does that include a church? Does it include a nonprofit? Is it solely governmental and quasi-governmental. It could be defined broadly or narrowly, but it's not defined, it's not a definition anywhere at all.
Civic use type is actually found in another chapter of 18A, and includes all of the things that you just listed. And it's quite extensive. We can provide you more details on that later, Mr. Branstetter, if you'd like. And my thought is that we're using the civic uses section in 18A to define that within the sub-area plan. Okay.
Yeah, I guess I would want to make sure that all those civic uses in 18A are on the list of things we want to allow in the central business district. We want to put a humane society.
And just to orient me a little bit, when we say, I'm looking at my page 214 of our packet, which is referencing item 5 of our discussion on civic uses, which refers to page 147. What page 147?
And my apologies, you're going to find in 5, 6, 7, and I believe 8, those are actually page references to the June 20th Planning Commission.
Okay.
So my apologies, if you were trying to search that out, that's an incorrect site for you, and I can provide you with the correct sites. So if there's no other questions there, number 6 was discussing the requirement for common open space that's being proposed within the downtown sub-area plan. Currently, within the city, there's a total of 80 square feet required, and that's under 18A 50, 231, C1, sub O, and P. There's a general 30 square foot per dwelling unit, and then there's also a 50 square foot per dwelling unit for children's play area, so a total together of 80. What you see starting on page 215 of your packet, and for several more pages, are comparative excerpts out of a couple of other jurisdictions' codes. So Burien, for instance, it's a minimum of 200 square feet. Kent, it's 150. Lacey talking about 20% of the gross site area for common open space purposes. Puyallup has recently changed theirs, and that'll be part of a response that you'll see next week to Mr. Guerrero's second letter. But they've just this year, I believe, changed some of their requirements, and so we'll provide you with the latest information from Puyallup. Then you'll see in Redmond, it's about 100 square feet, and Tacoma, again, it's by percentage. So comparatively, what the Lakewood City Code currently requires is below all of these, and the suggestion is to bring it within the downtown sub-area up to that 100 square foot.
So, curious on Puyallups, when they say private open space ground floor dwelling unit, that's pretty self-explanatory. Is that private open space upper floor, where it's defined as 10 by 8 instead of square footage? Is that a mandatory lanai, or is it actually?
That size is probably a balcony.
Yeah. Mr. Polkey.
Thank you, Mayor. That whole open space thing piqued my interest. We were, again, in the Lakewood position of, we always want to be the least, the last, whatever the case may be. So, and oddly, just amazingly enough, we were like, had the least open space requirement in a city that doesn't have a lot of open space. So, of the plans, it looks like maybe the newer plans have the 20%. Others have the hard amount. I mean, I would think Kent is reasonable at 150. I guess I'll throw this open to you, Mr. Buer. I mean, maybe this is something when we're looking at 18A, we need to change for the entire city going forward, because clearly we don't do enough. I mean, in my opinion, our amount is not adequate, clearly, given what other cities are doing in their region. So.
Yes.
So, I mean, so when we
bring back 18A, based upon the comments that I'm hearing this evening, we will increase the open space requirement.
Okay.
For apartment type style living.
Okay, so citywide.
Citywide.
Okay.
What about?
If that's the count, what the council wants to do.
What about commercial redevelopment and open space? Since where we want open space is in the core of the city, and it's right out here, and we don't own it. require a number of things for redevelopment. Is there any way to link redevelopment of commercial space to the provision of some open space or mitigation if you don't do it right there? A lineal park.
There's a great nexus when you're talking about residential development and open space. If you have a plan that talks about creating an open space area in a commercial part of the city, and you have a designated area that's going to be using it, it seems to me there might be an appropriate way to require something in the form of some sort of a lieu fee process, which we talked about as a part of the Sudbury plan previously, or even discussing potential impact fees for commercial development. But I don't know what that looks like right now. But it seems to me that if you're trying to go for open space and create this aspect of increase in pedestrian activity and creating a sense of place, all of these businesses benefit from that park or a proposed park. So there's a connection there. If that's something you want us to explore, we'll find a way legally to see if that's possible.
So on some of the streets, the requirement is for setbacks is 0. Okay, and we're trying to encourage mixed-use development, which would be commercial with some residential above. So where does the open space go?
In that particular case, you would establish a boundary where you are proposing to place a park, and then you would require all commercial developments, even if it's not residential, to pay their proportionate share, whatever that might be.
But
it won't necessarily be on the site,
Yeah,
Mr.
and
Bernstein.
I understand that if we create a code that says you mandatorily have to have so much open space per dwelling unit or per square footage of commercial footprint, maybe, to go and do that, but then you also create setbacks and other things that make that impossible. You're really just forcing people to contribute to a park, but not because you're not really looking for there to be open space there to be able to go and do that. And I guess, and thinking about the Proctor district, does the roof count as open space if you develop it that way?
In some codes, they create private open space on a mixed-use building.
Rooftop decks, right?
Yes. I'm sorry, what did you say?
Rooftop decks.
Rooftop decks. So I've even seen rooftop parks in San Francisco and other areas around San Francisco.
And one of the things that's included within the draft plan right now is the option for fee in lieu for park space, meaning not all of it needs to go on site. You have the opportunity right now, the way it's written, to have up to half of what they would otherwise provide on site would go toward some off-site park or collective area. So the setback to the street frontage, say that moves your building right up to the edge, there's the space behind the building on the lot for parking and or open space. You may not see your open space up by the street, but there may be open space on site. And then there's going to be this option potentially for putting money in a pot toward the other larger community open spaces.
It does seem that the greater open space requirement we make, we want to make a greater one, even though we're trying to make a denser area of the city, is that by increasing the square footage and say that we want you to have open space, but stay within all these other things, it really seems that we're forcing you to pay the impact fee for the park. As a strategy, because there's no other really realistic economical way to do that, particularly if you increase even above what's already proposed as a square footage of open space per dwelling unit.
We will continue with that, provide you research and examples for next Monday as to where maybe there's been commercial open space options provided in other jurisdictions.
So, yeah, I'm no planner. My concern is if you squeeze development and you make people go up, when the sun comes out, the people come down, and they gotta go somewhere. Especially if you have kids, and you're not gonna have a livable city if there isn't a place for people to be outside.
Well, Mr. Mayor, I guess when I look at Tacoma's numbers on page 217, and they have the 20% requirement, so they don't even do they don't even do feet per dwelling unit, they do the 20%, which seems like a lot to me. And then they have side yard and in common and that kind of thing. They can't be doing that in their downtown developments. I just fail to see how they do that. So they must create exemptions. And so I've asked Mr. Buer, I would ask staff to look at that if, because Tacoma's requirement seems like, and our requirement, and if we increase the requirement, would seem to do better outside the core, but if you're gonna build lot line to lot line practically and underneath parking, you can't hit those requirements, so there must be a way they must pay in lieu of to allow them to build some open space somewhere.
Is there building sidewalk to sidewalk? You know?
No.
No.
Do you know Tacoma?
It's also very difficult to comprehend Tacoma's codes. It takes a lot of work to figure out what they're doing.
I thought they were the simplest code in the world. That's what we were always told.
That's right. The gold standard, right? That's right.
Did you write this, Heidi?
So all I'm saying is, my earlier comments are an overarching comment that, because we do have demand for new apartment buildings in the city of Lakewood, that we need to take a look at 18A. So when you have these bigger developments like what's happening in Springbrook, that we have a number that is a more modern number. But then we try to find out what cities who are building in the downtown core, like Tacoma, how they take that open space thing and figure it out, because they can't be leaving any open space. I mean, those are lot line to lot line developments downtown, so they've got to be doing something.
And again, it goes back to, I don't know this, but in some cities there would be, if it's a commercial development, they're not gonna have a park requirement. The residential ones will. And so I don't know if that's the case in Tacoma or not. But we'll certainly provide information to the council for next week. Number 7, from Mr. Guerrero on page 217 of your packet, refers to parking and off-street parking and getting credits against what would be required when there's public parking or shared parking opportunities nearby. And what you see as the response is the current table that explains that there's a number of places within the plan already talking about doing a parking study and figuring out how to activate underutilized places such as parking lots. And in addition, you'll see reference to proposed code 18A 35600, subsection B, which is in the middle of page 218, and it shows you the different ways right now that reductions in credits are contemplated. There is one sentence in red that's a suggested addition to make it clearer that this is the intent, where when you have on-street parking, that can be counted toward required parking availability.
And if I could add something to this, this is not just specific to the sub-area plan, but this would be specific citywide. This really plays out interestingly in the Lakeview neighborhood, where we have very wide streets that are 80 feet that are not developed to their full width, and then people are using that area to park their vehicles. We're getting development proposals at the very early stage at this time where people are wanting to use on-street parking to meet their parking demands. So I think this is appropriate. in certain neighborhoods, and I call that out as an example. This goes to beyond your sub-area plan, and I thought it would be necessary to share that with you.
At the page 219 then is the last question that came from Mr. Guerrero regarding transportation funding. And to put my legal hat on for a moment, we're not talking traffic impact fees within this proposal. This is not 8202 RCW traffic impact fees. What's being discussed and proposed is to use SEPA mitigation fees. So currently, a developer comes in, whether it's anywhere in the city of Lakewood, and has a SEPA analysis of the transportation impacts they're going to have on the nearby area, and there is mitigation determined project by project. What's being proposed here is to say that these identified streets, maybe whether they're being revised, whether they're being taken from private to public, there's a cost that all of these anticipated trips are going to contribute toward. The SEPA analysis is done ahead of time, and this number is figured out, divided to figure out the number per trip that they would be responsible for, and then the number of trips they're responsible for is dependent on the type of use they're building. So there's calculations we'll provide for you next week that gives you a couple of examples of this, how to get from A to B, how to say, how much am I physically going to have to pay? But again, this is all SEPA mitigation. This is not an impact fee. Having said all of that, I'm sorry.
So how does that make a difference to a developer? That they're charged under a different part of this, of the RCW?
Use this room getting sued.
You said it, not me.
I mean, I'm serious. I mean, what's?
To them, it's the same, it's money out of pocket.
From this, you don't, you're basically cutting back time the developer has to deal with SEPA, because as far as this process is concerned, there's a much more truncated SEPA application you fill out.
And there isn't, this would set it out in advance and you wouldn't have the appeal of the calculation of the traffic impact fee.
Right, you would also, traffic impact fee is for a limited period of time. In lieu fees, as we're proposing here, extended out, and what we're proposing is 10 years. The reason we're suggesting 10 years is because we're talking $43 million in improvements to roads and streets. And the idea would be, you know, a 50% match between the city and the developer. And as we collect these funds, we would also be in the process of looking for other sources of revenue to speed this up.
You got some matching funds at that point, right?
Well, yeah, I guess though, when our consultant was putting this together and was trying to show us the comparative costs between us and other jurisdictions regarding the fees to do this, they compared this fee to the impact fees in other cities. In other words, it reminds me of the mayor's conversation about stormwater fees, or whether they're a fee or a tax, to be able to go and do that. I mean, you know, I mean, this is, maybe it isn't the legal definition of an impact fee, but it's certainly a generic definition of an impact fee to be able to go and do that. And I guess, you know, we have lots of transportation needs in the city. And we've actually been doing very, very well at meeting them broadly with some flexibility. But in terms of transparency of when we collect this fee from a developer, that, and we put a time limit on when it will be spent, we're limiting our flexibility to use our discretionary dollars, and that we've got to now focus dollars at the downtown, even if we'd rather put it over on to help develop Lakewood Landing, or we want to do other arterials to be able to go and do that. Well, when we go with this model of being able to do it, as opposed to the SEPA model of where people pay for, and actually at the time they develop it, build things that are needed to support what they're doing, such as when Walmart being maybe the biggest advantage example up here of where things were built in a real time. And if this also impacts one of the things that I don't understand, okay, we adopt this, and I build something go in and get permitted in 2019. Okay, and I produce 30 trips. And so the calculations will tell me how much money I've got to pay out of it, whatever the percentage is, depending on whether we use option 1, modified 1, or 2, okay? And then 10 years goes by. And in 2029, another developer comes in and he builds something that's similar to what I have and is in the 30-trip model. But somehow we've got to have come up with the cash, and maybe we built something and maybe not. But where's the inflator that his 30 trips are a percentage of a bigger number than the guy who built in 2019? Because the real cost of building these things, these numbers that are here on this chart, are 2018 numbers. That if you build it in 2018, then your percentage should be of the 2018 numbers, even though we're not going to build it till 2024 maybe, which is, so we're going to end up, the city's going to be more like 56-44 because of the rate of doing that. But the person who builds that later, his percentage should be based not on 2018 numbers, but on numbers that have been inflated to correspond to 2020, 2022, 2024. And something like that should be built into that rather than sticking with the 2018 numbers.
There's several comments I would like to try to take out from your inquiry. First of all, I do believe with the adoption of the sub-area plan, the council is going to have to spend more time on its transportation improvement plan and CIP, because you're going to be looking at these specific projects as well as other projects throughout the city. And not so much that the money is all going to go to the downtown plan, but you're going to have to find a balance between the downtown plan and other projects that you want to do. So I do think in future years you'll be spending more time in reviewing your transportation projects. And I think the sub-area plan is kind of forcing you to do that. And that's not a bad thing. Now, getting back to the other part of Mr. Brandstair's comments, the fees that you see, these cost allocations, we've talked about this internally. This is actually going to go into your master fee schedule. Okay? And so these fees will be in place for a 2-year period. And then as we go through the budget process, every 2 years, we would then go through the process of updating the fees based upon inflationary factors, cost increases in materials, and so forth. So that's how we're trying to adjust the fees over time so that they become relevant. We don't want to do something like some cities have done, which was what, Puyallup or Pierce County?
Well, both.
Both. Which they've adopted the fees and they'll leave them there alone for a long, long period of time, and then the numbers don't work anymore, and then they have to go and make these big adjustments that nobody likes. So the idea is to tie it to your budget process and to tie it to your CIP and TIP, and to make sure that the council is aware of all these inner working parts and that you understand how the allocations are going to be made, and not that the downtown plan is going to force you to put all your money in one pot, but to give you the opportunity to say, these projects are a priority in these neighborhoods, but so is the downtown, and this is how we're splitting our limited funds.
Back to Ms. Spear.
So those are the responses to Mr. Guerrero's comments. Going back to the beginning of the memo then are some responses to council questions from last week, or the 16th, one or the other. First of all, there was a question from the mayor about the response from the economic development manager. There's a memo on the last page of this for you to read from Ms. Newton. There was a conversation about needing more clarification about how does a developer walk through this process step by step. So on page 209, there's text and then a graphic that explains the logic behind that. We'll provide you for next week 2 physical examples of walking through from beginning to end of the permit review process, as well as that information about dollars that I mentioned just a moment ago.
I want to make sure that the council is very comfortable with the fee process and how it works, and it will be calculated with new projects as they move forward.
There's a video that was provided to you, I believe, on Friday. It's available now on the lakewooddowntownplan.org website that provides some graphics of what's potential in terms of build-out of the downtown area. There was some questions, and there's an answer starting on page 210 regarding the differences between modified alternative 1, which was developed during the Planning Commission deliberations, and then alternative 2, which is ultimately what the Planning Commission recommended to you. The very basic difference between alternative 1, Mod Alt 1, and alternative 2 was the amount of the expected 3.0 million new square feet of commercial that the city is anticipated through a couple of different prediction models to be able to absorb, and we'll see in the next 20 years, how much of that is anticipated and estimated to come into the downtown area specifically. And so what you see under Mod Alt 1 is that 55% of that would come into the downtown area, as opposed to alternative 2, where 95% would come in. And so that translates into however many thousands of units under Mod Alt 1 versus Mod Alt 2. And the same applies for the housing. It's just assuming that more of the growth citywide is going to be concentrated within this sub-area. Other than that, you have the same downtown development code that would apply under those alternatives. You have the same mitigation requirements and transportation projects that would be required under either one of those alternatives. So it's really fundamentally just how much growth is going to happen between those two, and whether the city council would want to just say, this is what we prefer versus one over the other. Your, excuse me, planned action ordinance has anticipated and done the environmental review all the way up to alternative 2. So if you were to go with that, and then a developer comes in with a project that follows it, they get the get out of jail free, if you will, on the SEPA analysis. It's already been done for them.
And I think given the time, we want to make sure we don't start slopping over into the planned action ordinance in
Correct.
18A.
Yeah.
Or we will slop over into it tomorrow.
Okay. So just to finish this up then, when the mayor mentioned he wanted to talk about the downtown plan itself, what the downtown plan includes is the vision, which is a result of your work. It's a result of the public outreach and the developer forum comments that were received in 2017, 2018. It has the concept plan, so that idea, if you recall, of the green and the pink showing you where things would be emphasized or anticipated by the city by doing some public investment. It's got policies and strategies to implement that concept. And then it breaks out into 8 or 9 different subsections, what could be done as a strategy for instance, urban design and land use, economic development, housing, street grids, parks and open space, stormwater. It wraps up with an implementation plan. And so within a short, mid, or long term, you would have particular agencies within the city working potentially with private development or with other agencies outside, for instance, the utilities, to work toward completion. And then Appendix A of the plan is that colonial district design we were talking about earlier with Mr. Guerrero's comments. And then there is a capital facilities plan, Appendix B. So that's the content of the plan itself. If there's any other questions on that.
And you're going to come back with some option or options with respect to different boundaries on that.
I have a laundry list, Mr. Mayor, of things that still coming back.
So, a lot of homework.
Just a quick logistics question. If we tweak some of these based on the commons plan, we don't have to go back for a public hearing, do we, on the tweaked plan?
As long as the changes are minor and not substantive in nature, and so far what I'm hearing they're not, you don't need to go back for another public hearing. And also too, if the council needs more time, you're not ready to adopt on August the 6th, that's fine too.
Personally, I don't see that happening. It's a complicated order. make a,
Because
you make
James
it,
will have a third letter by then.
make a 25-year, yeah, 25-year decision in 3 weeks. Thank you very much. A lot of hard work. It's even harder to try to make me understand it. So we move to reports by the city manager, who's still on Cape Cod time. So he asked if he could get a pass tonight, but he's,
Mayor, if I could just give a couple of calendar updates.
okay.
This Wednesday, July 25th, from 11:30 a.m. to 2 p.m., we'll have our second quarter employee appreciation event out at Fort Steilacoom Park. Also, on Friday, a couple of events happening. The first is the city is partnering with a number of organizations to sponsor a family day for our community connector, the 2-2 Stryker Brigade, and that'll be at Harry Long Stadium. That'll go from 9 a.m. to 3 p.m., and again, it's on Friday. And Colonel Maselli, the commander of the brigade, will have some opening remarks at 9 a.m. and some closing remarks at 3 p.m. And then there'll actually be cake. There'll be a cake cutting ceremony at 11 a.m. as well. So if you could mark your calendars for that. Also on Friday, from noon to 3 p.m., Lakewood's Choice is going to has their annual block party over at Springbrook Park, and that's from 12 to 3. And then lastly, our Parks and Recreation Department is working on a series of concerts at Fort Steilacoom Park at the new park and the pavilion. And so we've tentatively confirmed the following Tuesdays, August 14th, 21st, and 28th, from 6 p.m. to 8 p.m. The August 14th event would be kind of a ribbon cutting ceremony and a dedication event facilitated by the city. And the musical entertainment will include the Pierce College Taiko Drum Group, followed by military brass band. And then on the 21st, looking at the Tacoma Refuge Choir, and then the Tacoma Narrows, which I guess is a folk bluegrass type band. And then on August 28th would be the Paige Hansen Band, which is a jazz type band. So that's kind of where we are. We're still working through the details. Also, I'm hoping to share with you a plaque of what would go up on the pavilion in the park building, given that is a city building, and I'm hoping to share that with you later this week. So look for that via probably electronically. So that's what I have, Mayor.
Any questions for the city manager? It's a couple of you weren't here last week. I mentioned I had an engagement immediately after the Summerfest with the Phil-Am Association, and a number of the performers were there and were very appreciative of being able to perform on the new stage. They went out of their way to mention that. So, council comments, Mr. Branstetter, Mr. Volkey.
I'm good,
Yes, sir.
Mayor.
Mr. Whalen.
Come on.
I gotta at least explain, I came back from the Farnborough Air Show. I went as part of a State Department of Commerce delegation representing the Economic Development Board for Tacoma Pierce County with Doug Richardson, Bruce Kendall, who's the CEO of the EDB, a gentleman by the name of Kevin Clegg, who was with Economic Development County.
Acting director of
Yeah,
Economic
and
Development.
a couple of others from the Economic Development Board. Anyway, the focus was to schmooze and recruit businesses involved in the aerospace industry, typically vendors, suppliers for the Boeing aerospace industry, and we made some good inroads, had some 3 or 4 what we would call hot leads potentially for businesses to expand or invest here, a few warm leads, and so could be good. That was a good trip, paid for by the EDB for me. No city money.
Well, I spent a few days out of town, but I did see social media posts from both former Mayor, Council Chair Richardson and Mr. Whalen. I would note that Mr. Richardson spent his spare time going to the Imperial War Museum, the Churchill War Rooms, and cathedrals. Mr. Whalen was pub crawling. So-
Didn't run the race, I ran the 10K.
Just saying.
Doug was there with me.
Yeah. He was taking the pictures, right?
Yeah, exactly.
He knows how to get them. If there's nothing further, we're adjourned. Well, you know, I got an email from Mary, and